Even so, no decision was final. Supplies remained dangerously low. Morale wavered between resilience and collapse. Weather changes signaled another reason to fear staying. Storms erupted more often. Violent winds tore through treetops, and animal migration patterns seemed altered, forcing desperate hunts. Some believed the land itself rejected them. Others claimed the gods were showing anger. The truth was simpler. Vinland was not empty, not waiting, not theirs to mold. And Leif realized that history would judge him not only by courage, but by wisdom. In the weeks following the Silent River disaster, internal conflict grew sharper than any external threat. Before, every Viking saw themselves as adventurers driven by hope. Now, they questioned who they were and whether their cultural ideals still made sense in this distant world. Everything about Vinland challenged their identity. Inside Leif's butter, arguments filled the nights. One group, led by the fiercest warriors, believed that to leave Vinland meant surrender. They pointed to sagas describing heroes who fought impossible odds, claiming that their ancestors would dishonor them if they retreated. These men sharpened blades daily, insisting action must be taken, and soon. They even proposed a night raid into the forest to burn indigenous settlements, using surprise as leverage. Their logic centered on Viking tradition: be feared, not pitted. Opposing them stood the settlers whose hopes were never tied to conquest. Farmers, craftsmen, children, women. They envisioned homes, crops, cattle, and trade. To them, Vinland represented peace, not war. They believed departure was not cowardice, but wisdom, a return to Greenland where social structure and community already existed. They argued that exploration fulfilled its purpose. Vinland was discovered, charted, and understood as real. Most importantly, it could not be held by force. Political leaders, meanwhile, wrestled with logistics. Greenland needed timber urgently. Vinland was proof that the colony could survive long-term if western travel continued. That meant voyages must continue, even if settlement failed. Ships could sail west, load wood, and return, creating a supply network that would strengthen the colony. Some leaders dreamed of economic expansion: walrus ivory, furs, timber, and trade routes that could rival European markets. They imagined Greenland rising from remote isolation into global involvement. Religious voices also found meaning. Christian priests proclaimed the Vinland journey a sign from God that world boundaries were meant to be crossed. They saw indigenous people as potential converts and envisioned missions traveling back west to spread the Christian message. Meanwhile, pagan believers interpreted Vinland as a gift from Odin, a quest rewarded. To them, Leif represented a favored son of Norse destiny. These competing religious interpretations intensified discussion, showing how Vinland shaped not only geography, but spirituality. Vinland also challenged Greenland identity. The island had always been viewed as the western edge of civilization, the frontier. Now, frontier became stepping stone. Young men who once dreamed only of farming now dreamed of following Leif. They trained with weapons, studied sailing, and begged to join future voyages. They saw exploration not as madness, but as destiny. Women, too, saw possibility. Some imagined new land where their children might grow without famine. They had seen too many Greenlandic winters leave families weakened. Vinland offered hope for a richer life. Their voices influenced husbands and sons, quietly shaping future decisions. But one uncomfortable question lingered beneath celebration. What about the indigenous people living there? Many Greenlanders struggled to understand Leif's warnings. They had never met indigenous cultures, never imagined entire societies existing across the ocean. Some believed peaceful trade possible. Others saw only enemies blocking future settlement. The conflict narrative stirred anger among warriors eager for honor, while pragmatic leaders feared provoking threats they could not fully fight. The Vinland story created both unity and fracture. It awakened ambitions and fears simultaneously. More than anything, it forced Greenlanders to confront a new truth. The world was far larger, stranger, and richer than they had ever believed. The ripples of that realization reached across oceans. Within months, ships traveling from Greenland to Iceland carried stories of Vinland in their cargo. Words, rumors, and awe. When Icelanders stepped onto docks and heard sailors speak of new continents, shock spread just as it had in Greenland. Iceland, long connected to Norway and mainland Europe through trade, became a bridge for Vinland information. Travelers repeated the tales in taverns and churches. Skalds recited poetic versions that sounded almost mythic. There lies beyond the storming waves, a land of forests full of graves, of giants old and rivers wide, where golden summers never die. Yet Icelandic elders knew these were not mere poems. They questioned sailors intensely, demanding proof. What did they bring back? What berries had they described? What distances were recorded? Slowly, credibility formed. Skeptical voices faded. Icelandic society recognized that the Norse world had touched another continent. Such news attracted Norway's attention quickly, especially in royal circles. Norway valued land, power, and expansion. When word reached King Olaf's court that Leif Erikson had found a western land full of timber, fertile soil, and fish, interest flickered in the political elite. Some advisors urged immediate military investment, believing Vinland could become a colony under Norwegian authority. A western outpost would provide prestige and strategic control over the Atlantic. Others advised caution. The story of indigenous defenders troubled them. They feared long, costly conflict, especially since the Norse world had limited manpower. Still, curiosity outweighed hesitation. Each piece of the Vinland saga, the wooden beams, the buried descriptions, the climate reports, represented opportunity. Scholars, priests, and sea captains gathered in royal halls to discuss possibilities. They debated whether the Norse should send settlers or trade fleets. They wondered whether Vinland lay near mythical islands referenced in ancient texts. Imagine sitting at a firelit Norwegian table, maps spread across wooden surface, men arguing about whether the world curved more westward than anyone believed. Vinland sparked scientific imagination long before science became formal discipline. Priests saw Christian opportunity. They believed indigenous peoples could be converted, believing Viking arrival was divine plan. Church leaders spoke passionately about sending mission voyages. Political figures listened, seeing religion as tool for colonial justification. But deeper reflection revealed reality. Travel across the Atlantic was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. Few nations could afford repeated voyages. Meanwhile, Icelandic sailors who had crossed to Greenland spoke of Vinland as reachable, but not easily livable. They described war, ambushes, and climate unpredictability. They warned that indigenous groups were strong and skilled. These testimonies balanced enthusiasm with caution. This information caused internal conflict within Norway. Nobles wanted glory. Sea captains wanted safety. Priests wanted conversion. Merchants wanted profit. Everyone dreamed, but few were ready to risk resources for an uncertain future. A western outpost would provide prestige and strategic control over the Atlantic. Others advised caution. The story of indigenous defenders troubled them. They feared long, costly conflict, especially since the Norse world had limited manpower. Still, curiosity outweighed hesitation. Each piece of the Vinland saga, the wooden beams, the buried descriptions, the climate reports, represented opportunity. Scholars, priests, and sea captains gathered in royal halls to discuss possibilities. They debated whether the Norse should send settlers or trade fleets. They wondered whether Vinland lay near mythical islands referenced in ancient texts. Imagine sitting at a firelit Norwegian table, maps spread across wooden surface, men arguing about whether the world curved more westward than anyone believed. Vinland sparked scientific imagination long before science became formal discipline. Priests saw Christian opportunity. They believed indigenous peoples could be converted, believing Viking arrival was divine plan. Church leaders spoke passionately about sending mission voyages. Political figures listened, seeing religion as tool for colonial justification. But deeper reflection revealed reality. Travel across the Atlantic was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. Few nations could afford repeated voyages. Meanwhile, Icelandic sailors who had crossed to Greenland spoke of Vinland as reachable, but not easily livable. They described war, ambushes, and climate unpredictability. They warned that indigenous groups were strong and skilled. These testimonies balanced enthusiasm with caution. This information caused internal conflict within Norway. Nobles wanted glory. Sea captains wanted safety. Priests wanted conversion. Merchants wanted profit. Everyone dreamed, but few were ready to risk resources for an uncertain future. Some historians later suggested that if Norway had invested fully into Vinland colonization, European contact with North America might have occurred centuries earlier than Columbus. But timing was not right. The Norse world was entering a period of internal restructuring, religious change, and political turbulence. Moreover, the economy could not sustain transatlantic empire building. Still, Vinland lingered in European imagination. It became whispered secret, recorded in sagas, preserved through oral memory. Though few believed they could occupy the land now, many believed descendants might try. Leif Erikson, meanwhile, became symbol of Western expansion. Icelandic families told children stories about him. Young boys sharpened wooden swords, pretending to be Leif. Girls braided stories into hair songs, describing Vinland's forests. Even though decades would pass before new voyages returned, Vinland had changed Scandinavia permanently. Now, the Norse people no longer lived at the edge of maps. They stood at the doorway of a planet. Vinland did more than expand physical geography. It expanded mental geography. Norse cosmology once portrayed the world as a balance of familiar territories surrounded by mysterious seas and mythic realms. Vikings believed Midgard lay at the center, bordered by oceans full of monsters and wonders. Beyond that, their understanding blurred. Distant lands existed, but maps remained incomplete. With Vinland, one unknown became known, and the chain reaction reshaped how people saw themselves. Suddenly, the ocean was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. Young people growing up after Leif's return inherited a worldview based on possibility. They did not fear the western horizon. They dreamed beyond it. This shift mirrored how human knowledge evolves. Each discovery enlarges what people think is possible. Vinland forced the Norse world to reconsider the planet as sphere rather than flat page. By the time explorers reached Newfoundland, their society was already stretched at edge of survival and ingenuity. Their ships represented culmination of centuries of trial and error navigation. Their decision-making reflected lessons learned at Icelandic volcano coasts and Greenland glacier fields. Their diplomacy attempts with indigenous peoples reflected experience trading with Sami herders in northern Scandinavia. Thus, Vinland fits historical momentum rather than random miracle. The Norse Atlantic world nurtured explorers mentally, materially, and spiritually. It produced generation daring enough to cross ocean because they already lived at boundary between life and impossibility. This interconnected web also explains why Vinland vanished. When Greenland collapsed during the Little Ice Age, entire western branch of Norse network fell inward. Without Greenland, no human chain existed to reach Vinland. Settlement died not because desire vanished, but because supply line broke. Economics may seem distant from heroic exploration, yet financial reality drove Norse expansion powerfully. The Vinland story cannot be understood without acknowledging trade pressures that forced westward movement, nor without analyzing how commerce networks shaped long-term survival goals. For Greenland especially, economy governed every dream and every risk. It is often romantic to imagine Viking explorers motivated purely by adventure, but economic survival was equal, if not greater, driving force. Greenland's primary export was walrus ivory. Throughout medieval Europe, Walrus tusks represented luxury material used for religious carvings, chess pieces, royal gifts, and elite decoration. Europe lacked walrus animals, so merchants depended heavily on Arctic suppliers. Greenlandic Norsemen secured their economic identity through hunting walruses along northern coast, often traveling hundreds of miles by ship in extreme weather conditions. Culturally, this knowledge affected art. Saga poetry gained new imagery. Instead of speaking only of European battles, poets now described voyages into lands filled with grapes, salmon, and towering forests. They blended truth and legend, creating a mythic Vinland that reached audiences far outside Greenland. Performers sang of rivers where stars danced on water, lakes so wide no eyes could see the end, and forests thick as night. Though exaggerated, these songs preserved essential truth. The world was larger than anyone had believed. Spiritually, Norse people faced identity redefinition. Pagan beliefs once anchored homeland identity to ancestral soil. Vinland demonstrated that identity followed the people themselves, not land boundaries. Christianity used Vinland as metaphor. God created worlds beyond understanding, and curiosity was not sin but purpose. This theological interpretation encouraged acceptance of exploration, easing tension between faith and science. Psychologically, Vinland gave Scandinavians pride mixed with humility. They felt honored to be first Europeans to reach Western shores, but humbled by indigenous resistance. They learned that discovery did not equal dominance, and that advanced technology did not guarantee victory. This humility spread through culture, shaping Norse diplomacy. Greenlanders and Icelanders who once believed in unstoppable Viking destiny now accepted that courage must coexist with wisdom. Economically, Vinland reshaped priorities. The desire for timber increased dramatically. Iceland held limited forests, Greenland nearly none. People envisioned future voyages not for permanent settlement, but for resource harvesting. Economists and traders saw Western voyages as potential backbone of Greenland's survival. Even without colonizing Vinland, the Norse world felt economically invigorated by its existence. And finally, educational transformation occurred. Children learned about Vinland in oral lessons. Teachers explained ocean currents, tides, and seasonal wind patterns. Youth trained in navigation with new seriousness, believing they might one day follow Leif's path. Knowledge that once belonged only to sailors spread to society at large. Vinland forced Scandinavians to see history not as linear, but circular. Exploration, failure, learning, adaptation. These cycles defined Viking evolution. The sagas that emerged from this era became historical documents future generations would treasure as evidence of human courage. Even though the Norse world's Vinland settlements faded, the knowledge remained permanently etched into cultural memory. The Vikings had crossed into a new continent, interacted with its people, and returned alive. Their journey reshaped humanity's understanding of geography centuries before the wider world realized the truth. Vinland proved that the Earth contained unseen continents, unknown societies, unimagined opportunities. And though it would take half a millennium before Europeans returned in vast numbers, the Norse had already opened the door. When the Vikings returned from Vinland, the first version of their story lived entirely in spoken memory. Norse culture relied heavily on oral tradition. Words passed through generations by firelight. Songs echoed through longhouses, and stories preserved in poetic form. Literacy existed, but writing on parchment was costly and reserved for religious needs or legal matters. Therefore, the earliest Vinland history was not written by a scribe with ink. It was woven into memory by voices. The returning explorers served as living documents, and their accounts rippled outward like waves across the North Atlantic world. What made their narrative so powerful was its uniqueness. Unlike other voyages that followed familiar sea paths, Vinland pushed Norse reality past the known map. During gatherings, explorers described forests taller than any seen in Scandinavia, rivers overflowing with salmon, and lands that smelled like summer even during harsh months. People leaned close to hear every detail: the glowing berry vines, enormous lakes reflecting dawn light, strange animals in forests, and the silent stares of indigenous peoples. These descriptions became the foundation of the sagas. Long before anything was written down, the tales evolved into structured narratives. Skalds, professional poets, memorized the events, combining facts with stylized language. They built rhythm into description. Over ice seas we came, through storm and night we came, to Vinland's fertile, roaring shore. The Skalds shaped Vinland not only as a place, but as a character. It represented hope, struggle, loss, and honor. The Vikings did not merely travel there. They wrestled with destiny there. This framing gave the Vinland story mythic power. Even people who feared the dangers of exploration found inspiration in these tales. Eventually, church scribes began writing fragments in Latin script. Their work, though factual, lacked the rich emotional detail spoken within families. So, two parallel histories formed: academic notes and community memory. Over time, these streams merged into legendary texts such as the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Erik the Red. Both works contain truth, exaggeration, and centuries of narrative shaping. They used names like Leif the Lucky and described Thorvald's death by arrow in Vinland, a tragic reminder of cultural collision with indigenous peoples. The sagas also emphasized social behavior. They described how Vikings built structures, hunted, farmed, explored, and suffered. They preserved the emotional tension between curiosity and violence. The sagas portrayed indigenous peoples, called Skrælings by Norsemen, not as simple enemies, but as human adversaries whose presence defined the struggle for survival. Even though European accounts carried cultural bias, the sagas still acknowledged indigenous power and legitimacy. In the era before printing presses, the way sagas spread across communities shaped historical memory far more than later academic research. Every family who heard the stories retold them with their own additions. Some exaggerated battles, others downplayed conflict and focused on beauty. Some storytellers described Vinland as land gifted by gods. Others framed it as a test humanity failed. What made the Vinland sagas remarkable was their endurance. They survived centuries of political change, Christianization, climate hardship, and migration. While dozens of other medieval stories faded into silence, Vinland tales lived on because they represented human longing. People feared forgetting that their ancestors once reached beyond boundaries. The sagas became proof that the world had always been open, even when society chose to believe in limits. The oral-to-written transformation ensured that Vinland would not become myth lost to time. It became myth protected by documents. By the medieval period, scribes copied versions into manuscripts. Monks preserved them in libraries. Communities passed them down through recitation. Long after the Norse settlement faded, long after Greenland declined, long after Viking culture evolved, the sagas remained alive. In this way, Vinland became more than history. It became identity, memory, possibility. The return from Vinland had not only changed geography, it changed minds. People who had once believed strength came from conquering now began questioning that assumption. Leif Erikson's generation had walked a path few cultures in the Middle Ages ever experienced. They met another world with different people, beliefs, and relationships to nature. And because they failed to settle that land permanently, they were forced to confront human limitation on an emotional level. After the journey, quiet reflection spread through Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. Norsemen who heard the story felt both pride and sadness. To them, Vinland was a symbol of human ambition, but also a reminder that ambition carries consequences. It challenged the old Viking worldview taught to children, that courage, steel, and ships could conquer anything. In Vinland, metal swords meant less than knowledge of forests. Shield walls meant little against hit-and-run archers. And bravery no matter how intense, could not overwhelm a people defending ancestral soil for thousands of years. This realization reshaped cultural self-awareness. Some Viking communities began questioning violence as the primary means of identity. They saw that other societies, not only Norse, could be powerful, intelligent, resourceful, and organized. This challenged biases. After centuries of raiding Europe, Norsemen had grown accustomed to seeing foreign peoples as victims. Vinland broke that belief forever. The indigenous communities proved equal in strategy and strength. Norse regret also grew as people discussed lost lives. Families grieved sons who died far from home. Mothers wept imagining their children's bones lying in American soil, never buried beside ancestors. The emotional cost of exploration, rarely written in official sagas, lived in everyday voices, those who mourned individuals rather than heroic figures. Beneath triumph lay human tragedy. Farmers reflected on survival realism. They needed timber and farmland, but they now understood land belonged to someone else. A society without empathy might have justified expansion by war, but the Norse world lacked resources for colonial brutality, and instincts urged caution. Many interpreted departure as moral victory, not defeat. Leaving prevented endless bloodshed. The honor lay not in domination, but in knowing when enough was enough. Clergy members offered deeper interpretation. Christian priests suggested God had shown the Norse the world's size, then reminded them not to claim what was not theirs. Pagan leaders believed Vinland was guarded by powerful land spirits, teaching humility. Both faith groups used Vinland to emphasize spiritual learning. The message was similar: humans must respect boundaries. Vinland also shaped gender perspectives. Women who never saw the land, nonetheless, carried emotional influence. They reminded men that children, not war, shaped the future. They encouraged choosing life over glory. Their voices helped guide community decisions away from reckless revenge. For the first time in Norse history, weakness and wisdom became compatible. People admitted that retreat did not mean shame, but survival. In Scandinavian culture, heroic death once defined honor. But Vinland made living with knowledge more important than dying blindly. Lessons were preserved not through war trophies, but through storytelling. This collective reflection influenced Viking politics too. Ambitious leaders hoping to rule new lands reconsidered their plans. They saw that even if Vinland were conquered, maintaining a colony across the Atlantic would be nearly impossible with medieval technology. The Norse world could not sustain empire building, nor should it try. In truth, the greatest lesson came from cultural contact. The indigenous peoples taught Vikings that land was not simply space to claim. It was living context tied to ancestry, spirituality, and memory. They showed Vikings that geography held identity deeper than possession. Through Vinland, Norse society matured. They realized their future lay not in dominating unknown continents, but in understanding how expansive the human world truly was. Even centuries later, this knowledge helped Scandinavia embrace global connection rather than isolation. Vinland was not a story of failure. It was a story of human growth. As decades turned into centuries, the Vinland story transformed from fresh memory into legendary heritage. The original explorers died, their children aged, and their grandchildren inherited only words. But unlike many fragile oral legacies, Vinland endured because people needed it. It became a cultural anchor, evidence that the Norse were not prisoners of cold northern seas, but pioneers touching the edges of the unknown world. In Greenland, the Vinland memory lived strongest in places where wood from America supported daily life. Many houses constructed from Vinland timber lasted for generations. People who touched those beams touched North America without ever leaving home. Children were told, these walls were born across the Western Ocean. Such physical reminders kept Vinland grounded in reality. Residents felt pride knowing their community survived not only because of courage, but because of Atlantic exploration. Meanwhile, in Iceland, storytellers expanded the tale creatively. They blended history with supernatural elements, imagining Leif guided by guardian spirits or dreaming of Vinland decades before he sailed. Some stories claimed Vinland berries cured illness. Others said spirits of the land whispered through trees. These poetic inventions did not distort truth. They kept Vinland alive emotionally. When Europe entered the medieval period of increased writing, scribes recorded Vinland sagas into manuscripts that later became priceless historical sources. These sagas ensured that Vinland would not vanish like minor events in ancient memory. Instead, it took on identity equal to major Viking expeditions to Ireland, England, France, or Russia. Vinland became cornerstone of Norse achievement. Centuries later, when the Norse colonies in Greenland collapsed due to climate change and economic isolation, Vinland's stories remained. In fact, the memory became even more romanticized. People looked back to the past as Golden Age, imagining Vikings braver and freer than modern settlers. Vinland represented this nostalgia. European scholars of the Renaissance studied Norse sagas and debated their authenticity. Some believe Vinland was fictional paradise, comparing it to Atlantis or fairy realms. Others argued passionately that evidence must exist. They noted the saga's practical descriptions, wind routes, tides, latitude markers, and realized such precision proved truth. Then, archaeological discoveries in the 20th century changed everything. At Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, excavations revealed Norse buildings, iron smelting sites, and tools matching Viking design. These finds prove Vinland was real beyond doubt. The world finally accepted what Norse oral tradition had claimed for 1,000 years. Scandinavians felt a resurgence of pride and validation. Modern historians interpret Vinland as first documented European presence in North America, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. Museums preserve artifacts. Universities teach courses about Norse exploration. Indigenous historians compare the sagas to native oral traditions, building bridges of understanding between cultures once isolated by time. Today, Vinland stands as symbol of global intersection, an early meeting place between European and American worlds. No empire formed there, no great settlement survived, yet the historical weight remains immense. It tells humanity that curiosity is older than conquest, that discovery does not require domination, and that cultural exchange can begin without colonial victory. Vinland endures through memory because it represents the human desire to look beyond horizons. The Vikings proved that boundaries, even oceanic ones, are illusions. Their story remains alive because it touches something universal, the belief that somewhere, beyond the next wave, lies another world. Vinland history is often told through the Norse lens because surviving sagas and archaeological discoveries come from Viking culture. However, another lens exists, one rooted in the oral traditions of indigenous North American peoples whose ancestors encountered, observed, and ultimately resisted Viking exploration. To construct a balanced historical story, we must consider how indigenous memory interacted with Norse arrival. Although these societies left no medieval written manuscripts, their cultural continuity, storytelling structures, and archaeological evidence reveal powerful narratives that deserve equal attention. Indigenous societies in Newfoundland, Labrador, and nearby areas were not isolated villages waiting to be discovered. They were complex networks of tribes belonging to distinct language families, including ancestors of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Dorset Paleoeskimo peoples. These communities sustained themselves through hunting, fishing, art, trade, and seasonal movement. Their relationship with the land was layered and spiritual. Rivers served as travel routes. Forests offered protection. Coasts provided food. Animal migrations dictated rhythm of daily life. When Vikings appeared on North American shores, these indigenous groups were not surprised by strangers. The world had brought travelers before. What shocked them was not European presence, but European behavior. Indigenous societies likely viewed the Vikings not through awe, but through careful suspicion. Oral knowledge systems taught them to read strangers' intentions through movement, structure, and consumption. Vikings cut trees immediately, hunted aggressively, and built permanent structures. To indigenous minds, this signaled land takeover rather than temporary visit. They understood danger quickly. Long before arrows flew, indigenous scouts examined Viking camps, testing boundaries without direct conflict. This established an observational map. How many lived there? What weapons they used? How they reacted to shadows among trees? How loud their voices were at night? And how well they cooperated with one another. In oral stories passed down through centuries, some indigenous traditions describe encounters with strange people wearing metal skins and carrying blades that shone like river reflections. Though names vary and details blur through time, the motifs remain consistent. Hostile outsiders, conflict over resources, sudden violence, and mysterious disappearance. These stories do not identify Vikings by name, yet their timing matches Norse settlement windows. Scholars in modern anthropology and archaeology interpret these fragments as potential memories of Vinland's contact period. The indigenous response to Viking presence demonstrated geopolitical intelligence. Tribes communicated across long distances, warning neighboring communities about the newcomers. They did not fight alone. Instead, they formed alliances, flexible regional coalitions united by threat awareness. This ability to assemble coordinated defense shocked the Vikings, who underestimated the political scale of the continent. Norse warriors had battled Europeans, but they had never faced a network of cultures defending home territory with speed and unity. To indigenous peoples, the Vinland conflict was not war for land. It was survival of identity. Their relationship to Vinland's forests went deeper than agriculture or housing. Trees represented ancestors. Rivers held sacred meaning. Animals were viewed as relatives, not commodities. The trade connected Greenland with Norway, Iceland, England, and sometimes continental Europe. However, ivory trade fluctuated. As European markets evolved, royal families reduced demand and alternate materials, like elephant ivory, entered competition. Sudden declines in market value threatened Greenland's stability. Without strong trade profits, Greenland could not afford necessary imports such as iron, timber, grain, and rope. Economic pressure led leaders to consider new revenue sources. Vinland seemed solution. Timber, furs, berries, and possibly grapes offered export possibilities. Lumber especially held tremendous value, since shipbuilding, carpentry, and construction all demanded wood. Vinland was timber paradise at a time when Europe and Iceland experienced shortages. Commerce also influenced the sequence of voyages. Leif Erikson's initial expedition likely included trade objectives beneath exploration narrative. Later voyages by Karlsefni emphasized cattle and farming transportation, suggesting attempts at trade-based colonization. When indigenous populations resisted settlement, economic logic weakened dramatically. Without peaceful exchange or export routines, Vinland could not justify risk. Further economic stress arose from navigation cost. Sailing ships west required reinforced hulls, skilled crews, emergency supply stock, and iron fastenings. Funding these voyages demanded support from wealthy families or chieftains. If Vinland ceased producing economic output, investors withdrew interest. The Norse did not operate colonial empires like later European nations. They relied on private wealth, and private wealth abandoned failure quickly. Global trade trends also turned against Greenland. When crusades opened Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markets, European buyers gained access to Asian goods, reducing interest in Arctic outputs. The fall of walrus ivory demand weakened Greenland's status. When strangers harvested wood urgently, indigenous viewers interpreted disrespect rather than necessity. The battle memories passed through indigenous generations carried emotional pride. Vinland stories did not glorify Viking bravery. Instead, they taught lessons about protecting land from outsiders who do not understand its spirit. Oral accounts emphasize careful watching, patience, and strategic withdrawal, qualities Europeans often misinterpreted as weakness. In truth, these behaviors demonstrate mastery of environment and commitment to spiritual guardianship of the land. Today, many indigenous historians and knowledge keepers interpret Vinland not through European timelines, but through long cultural continuity. To them, Norse arrival is a moment in thousands of years of human history on the continent, not the beginning. They remind us the Americas were not discovered by Vikings or Europeans. They were already mapped in memory, navigated through kinship systems, and governed through social laws that predated European arrival by millennia. Vinland, therefore, becomes not a first moment of civilization, but one chapter in a much older human saga. This perspective reframes history. It shows that both sides, Viking explorers and indigenous defenders, changed each other. Viking minds expanded, indigenous strategies sharpened, and North American memory grew stronger because it survived contact. Vinland shook Europe's worldview, but it also reinforced indigenous identity. From this shared history emerges a greater truth. Discovery is mutual, and cultural legacy belongs to all who lived it. Although Vinland was a Norse achievement, its influence spread quietly through Europe over centuries, echoing into philosophical, geographical, and scientific development. In medieval times, knowledge did not travel instantly. Words moved slowly, on ships, along trade routes, through monastic networks. But once rumors of a Western land reached European scholars, the idea that Earth held undiscovered continents began reshaping intellectual space. Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries was dominated by religious worldview. Most scholars believe humanity lived on a continent bounded by divine order. Yet whispers of Vinland challenged that framework. Even without full documentation, the notion that Scandinavians sailed beyond known world borders planted seeds of doubt. If one ocean could be crossed, could others? If land existed beyond the Atlantic, might there be lands beyond Africa? Medieval mapmakers re-examined world charts. They began drawing imaginary Western islands, labeling them Antilia or Brazil, phantom land masses inspired by Norse example. Though inaccurate, these additions proved that European thought had changed. Humans no longer believed they understood every coastline. Curiosity became new academic currency. Scientific progress grew from this curiosity. Navigation developed faster. Sailors began using latitude reading more frequently, inspired indirectly by Norse sun path practices. European ship design, though not directly copied, advanced through knowledge exchange among traders who admired Viking maritime resilience. By the 13th century, shipyards in Spain and Portugal experimented with wider hulls and deeper keels. Innovation rarely begins with imitation. It begins with thought. If Vikings crossed west, why can't we? Even the Catholic Church eventually recognized Vinland as significant. Though some priests doubted oral stories, Christianity respected achievement as divine sign. Missionaries considered Western lands suitable for conversion. This idea, though unrealized for centuries, influenced later missionary motivations during Iberian expansion. Vinland also influenced literature. Medieval romances, like tales of Avalon and far western islands, may carry echoes of northern rumor. Writers blended fantasy with truth, imagining golden islands, peaceful valleys, and distant societies untouched by European rule. These stories shaped European imagination long before Columbus. But perhaps the most far-reaching influence lay buried beneath centuries of dust. When Christopher Columbus sought funding for his western voyage, some historians believe he studied Norse accounts of Atlantic crossings. Though Columbus misunderstood geography, he carried fragments of Norse memory reinterpreted through medieval scholarship. Thus, Vinland's echoes indirectly helped trigger the age of exploration. This does not mean Vikings inspired global colonization intentionally, nor that they are responsible for later European imperialism. But historically, ideas function like seeds. Once planted, they grow across generations. Vinland proved oceans could be crossed. It proved continents existed beyond Europe. It proved cultural contact was possible. These truths shaped European cosmology permanently. Even beyond exploration, Vinland shaped European humility. Medieval scholars realized that Europe was not the center of human geography. They imagined people elsewhere, different skin, languages, beliefs. This realization shook intellectual arrogance. It encouraged respect, even if limited by later colonial biases. Today, academics agree that Vinland represented a major turning point in world history, even if Europe did not immediately act. It expanded thought long before it expanded maps. And though Norse settlements vanished, the idea of the West remained alive. Vinland taught Europe that the unknown was reachable, not myth, not magic, not forbidden. This mattered profoundly for scientific progress. Without challenging limits, people accept small worlds. Vinland showed humanity a larger one. A crucial chapter in the Vinland saga concerns the question historians often ask: why did the Viking presence in North America not endure? After all, the Norse had survived harsh climates, built complex settlements in Greenland and Iceland, and traveled thousands of miles across marine wilderness. Why did they leave Vinland behind? To understand, we must explore ecological, economic, cultural, and environmental factors that shaped their decision. First, climate played a major role. Around the year 1000 CE, the period of Vinland settlement, the North Atlantic experienced warmer temperatures known as medieval warm period. Warmer waters and calmer seas made crossing the Atlantic less dangerous. But shortly afterward, climate patterns began shifting toward what scientists now call the Little Ice Age. Longer winters, colder sea routes, and unpredictable storms increased maritime risk dramatically. Vikings could travel west during the warm window, but sustaining long-term colonies during climate transition became increasingly difficult. Next, economic reality shaped outcome. Greenland's economy depended on trade: walrus ivory, seal products, and occasional timber imports. Vinland offered valuable wood, but not guaranteed profit. Transporting lumber across thousands of miles was expensive. The Norse world lacked large-scale merchant fleets. These voyages were dangerous investments, and without state sponsorship, they carried risk communities could not afford. Agriculture also played a role. Although Vinland's soil was fertile, agriculture demanded stability. To farm, Norse settlers needed secure land, predictable seasons, and peaceful relations with neighbors. Indigenous resistance made farming nearly impossible. Even if Vikings could plow fields, defending them would require constant military presence. That effort outweighed reward. Social dynamics mattered too. Norse settlements depended on cultural unity, but Vinland introduced moral stress. Many Vikings who traveled there were not ordinary farmers. They were adventurers seeking glory or escape. While they built houses, they never fully built community identity. Greenland settlements thrived because people shared purpose and lineage. Vinland lacked generational continuity. Young families feared raising children in war zone. Conflict with indigenous peoples was a decisive factor. The Vikings did not understand North American political environment. They assumed initial trade would lead to peaceful coexistence, but they underestimated the cultural and territorial significance of the land. Indigenous societies had lived there for millennia. They would never allow foreign occupation. Their tactics, mobility, and knowledge overwhelmed Viking strategy. Even if the Norse had brought twice as many warriors, they still faced continent-sized defensive advantage. Distance from home further weakened morale. Greenland was remote, but Vinland was remote beyond imagination. If ships failed, settlers could be trapped forever. Supply lines stretched across freezing ocean. Greenland needed supplies itself. It could not support distant daughter colony. Religion may have influenced departure as well. As Christianity grew stronger in Norse society, The appetite for raiding and expansion weakened. Viking identity transitioned from warrior culture to more settled Christian communities. As values evolved, risking lives for new land felt less appealing. Finally, leadership continuity played a role. Leif Erikson was an exceptional leader with charisma, discipline, and vision. But he could not remain in Vinland permanently. When leadership rotated, unity and purpose fractured. Without stable command, colony could not grow. Thus, Vinland failed, not because Vikings were weak or foolish, but because historical timing was wrong. Environmental shifts, cultural transition, military resistance, and logistical barriers combined to make long-term settlement unsustainable. Yet this outcome carries deep meaning. Vinland was not meant to be conquered. It was meant to be discovered. By leaving Vinland, Vikings preserved peace, humanity, and the chance for future cultures to rediscover the continent without total collapse of its indigenous world. In that sense, the end of Norse North America was not tragic conclusion. It was wise conclusion. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vinland sagas existed in a strange space between truth and legend. Scholars debated their accuracy, readers questioned their credibility, and skeptics argued that Vinland was nothing more than myth. Then, in the mid-20th century, archaeology reshaped human understanding by uncovering physical proof that Viking explorers had truly reached North America. The discovery took place at Meadows, located on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. This breakthrough changed history forever, not only confirming the sagas, but reshaping how we understand medieval globalization. The site came to light because Helga Annenstein Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer and archaeologist team, believed the sagas described real landscapes. They searched Newfoundland coastlines methodically, guided by both science and instinct. In 1960, they found what appeared to be grassy mounds beneath soil layers, shapes suspiciously similar to collapsed Norse structures. Excavation revealed astonishing results. Walls built using sod and timber, iron nails, charcoal iron smelting pits, a forge, and artifacts unmistakably Norse. These discoveries matched Viking architecture, tool design, and cultural practice with precision impossible to dispute. Over time, archaeologists uncovered several recognizable buildings, including large halls similar to those used in Greenland and Iceland. These structures held multiple rooms, living spaces, storage areas, workshops, reflecting organized settlement rather than temporary camp. The site also revealed turf outlines of smaller huts and possible ship repair areas. Each section of discovery expanded the story. Not only had Vikings been here, they had stayed long enough to build, craft, and plan long-term habitation. One of the most groundbreaking discoveries was the presence of ironworking remains. Vikings were skilled ironworkers, forging nails and rivets essential for ship maintenance. At Meadows, archaeologists found slag, hammer scales, and furnace pits, material proof that Norse ironwork took place on American soil. No indigenous culture in the region practiced iron smelting during this period, making the evidence unmistakably Norse. Artifacts further validated cultural identity. Nordic-style spindle whorls, whetstones, bronze pins, and ring-headed needles all appeared within excavation layers. These items were used for textile work, household tasks, and daily life, reflecting presence of women or at least domestic labor. Their existence suggests that the settlement included more than just warriors. It was not a raiding outpost, it was a functioning community. The age of the site shocked historians. Radiocarbon dating placed settlement between 990 and 1050 CE, aligning perfectly with saga timelines describing Leif Erikson's voyages. The physical dates erased doubt. Vinland was not legend, it was real. This confirmation made the Viking presence in North America the earliest known European arrival by centuries, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. Visitors to Meadows today stand in a space where worlds once collided. The wind off the Atlantic tastes the same salty sharpness Leif may have felt. The grass that covers old building mounds whispers the same northern sound. It is a humbling reminder that history often hides beneath soil waiting for hands to uncover truth. Yet this discovery also challenges assumptions. Archaeology did not reveal mass graves, grand fortresses, or gold stores. Instead, the site appears limited in size and duration, consistent with seasonal base camp rather than full colony. The absence of large burial sites suggests most settlers returned home rather than perish there. Evidence supports saga interpretation. The Norse stayed, explored, met conflict, and left. Lance aux Meadows proves that human memory, preserved through sagas, can outlast nations, languages, and belief systems. Oral history, often dismissed, turned out to hold truth buried in poetry. Through archaeology, legend became science. Today, the site stands as UNESCO World Heritage Treasure, a testament to Viking ingenuity and the endurance of cross-cultural memory. It reminds the world that human exploration began long before global imperialism, driven by curiosity rather than conquest. And above all, it confirms that Vinland is no myth. It is a chapter of world history carved into Earth itself. While Lance aux Meadows remains the most significant archaeological site connected to Vinland, it is far from the only indicator of Viking presence in North America. Over decades, scientists, historians, and explorers investigated surrounding territories for additional signs of Norse activity. Their work revealed a mosaic of clues stretching across coastal Canada. Subtle, fragmented, yet collectively powerful. These discoveries show that Vinland was not one location, but a larger region of movement and interaction. One compelling piece of evidence includes butternut shells discovered at Lance aux Meadows. These nuts do not grow naturally in Newfoundland. They thrive hundreds of miles farther south, near modern New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. Their presence suggests Vikings traveled far beyond the settlement, likely through coastal expeditions or indigenous trade exchange. This revelation expands the imagined Vinland map, proving Viking exploration may have extended deep into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Additional Norse-style artifacts have been reported across Arctic Canada. In Labrador, researchers found a possible Norse bronze cloak pin fragment at a remote coastal site. It resembles objects used in Greenland during the same period, and while not definitive proof, it contributes to a pattern suggesting travel, trade, or drift of Norse goods through indigenous networks. Another discovery occurred on Baffin Island. Woven cord samples containing European wool fibers unlike any known indigenous material. Radiocarbon analysis places these fibers around the Norse contact period. Further excavation uncovered wooden tally, sticks etched with markings that resemble Scandinavian script. Some archaeologists believe these finds may represent trading exchanges between Norse Greenlanders and Arctic peoples, such as the Dorset or later Thule Inuit cultures. Rather than one-time encounters, this implies sustained cross-cultural contact in northern regions lasting generations. The Norse likely exchanged metal tools for furs, ivory, or Arctic resources. This theory, though debated, strengthens image of Vikings not as isolated explorers, but participants in early Atlantic cultural networks. Another piece of scientific evidence lies in shipbuilding traces. On islands near Newfoundland, researchers identified iron boat nails and Viking-style rivets washed into beaches from eroding sites. Some believe storm damage revealed remains of temporary landing stations, though most of these finds require deeper investigation. These clues expand historical imagination. Vikings did not simply arrive once, but likely returned multiple times, reinforcing Leif Erikson's voyages. Pollen samples taken from Newfoundland soils show surprising agricultural disturbance in the 11th century, patterns matching Norse farming technique. Grass species normally linked to European grazing environments appear suddenly, suggesting cattle may have fed in these regions. Though not conclusive alone, these samples match saga descriptions claiming livestock arrived with Thorvald and later explorers. Carbon isotope research also offers insight into Viking diet during Vinland time period. Traces from Greenland skeletal remains reveal diet shifts toward North American species, such as cod and salmon, around the Vinland era. This suggests food imports or travel between regions left biological markers in Norse bodies. Despite these exciting discoveries, caution is necessary. Archaeology demands proof beyond imagination. Many finds remain contested until confirmed by peer review. However, even contested evidence shapes questions. Did Vikings trade north? Did they sail repeatedly to gather timber? Did Greenland rely on North American goods? Modern technology continues opening doors. LiDAR scanning, laser mapping from the air, reveals soil anomalies across Atlantic Canada that could mask buried Norse structures. Ground-penetrating radar identified subsurface patterns in Newfoundland, hinting at additional settlement sites. These advances show that the Viking footprint in North America is still being uncovered. Vinland is not finished history, it is growing history. Each new discovery expands the story beyond sagas. It connects archaeology, genetics, botany, climatology, and anthropology in pursuit of a truth broader than any single field could find alone. And importantly, many discoveries result from collaboration with indigenous communities who share land knowledge. They guide scientists to unexplored territory, reminding the academic world that Western science alone cannot interpret thousand-year memory. Pollen samples taken from Newfoundland soils show surprising agricultural disturbance in the 11th century, patterns matching Norse farming technique. Grass species normally linked to European grazing environments appear suddenly, suggesting cattle may have fed in these regions. Though not conclusive alone, these samples match saga descriptions claiming livestock arrived with Thorvald and later explorers. Carbon isotope research also offers insight into Viking diet during Vinland time period. Traces from Greenland skeletal remains reveal diet shifts toward North American species, such as cod and salmon, around the Vinland era. This suggests food imports or travel between regions left biological markers in Norse bodies. Despite these exciting discoveries, caution is necessary. Archaeology demands proof beyond imagination. Many finds remain contested until confirmed by peer review. However, even contested evidence shapes questions. Did Vikings trade north? Did they sail repeatedly to gather timber? Did Greenland rely on North American goods? Modern technology continues opening doors. LiDAR scanning, laser mapping from the air, reveals soil anomalies across Atlantic Canada that could mask buried Norse structures. Ground-penetrating radar identified subsurface patterns in Newfoundland, hinting at additional settlement sites. These advances show that the Viking footprint in North America is still being uncovered. Vinland is not finished history, it is growing history. Each new discovery expands the story beyond sagas. It connects archaeology, genetics, botany, climatology, and anthropology in pursuit of a truth broader than any single field could find alone. And importantly, many discoveries result from collaboration with indigenous communities who share land knowledge. They guide scientists to unexplored territory, reminding the academic world that Western science alone cannot interpret thousand-year memory. As economy collapsed, population shrank. Some Greenlanders starved. Others abandoned farms. Some fled to Iceland or Norway. Climate added new strain. As temperatures dropped in 13th century, sea routes iced over, increasing cost and danger of travel. Ships had shorter travel seasons, reducing trade capacity. Without consistent supply chain, Vinland expeditions became impossible. It was not courage that ended voyages. It was economics strangling opportunity. We must recognize Vinland not simply as lost settlement, but as lost investment. It belonged to global economic network fragile under climatic and geopolitical change. Had markets remained stable, had Greenland remained populated, Vinland might have evolved into stable seasonal resource stop. But economies transform history as powerfully as weapons do. Looking beyond Norse world reveals similar patterns. Phoenician trade collapse ended Western exploration. Chinese treasure fleets ended when imperial budgets shifted. Polynesian expansion paused when population needs stabilized. Vinland fits universal truth. Exploration flourishes when money flows, collapses when money halts. This economic lens humanizes the past. Vikings were not mythic heroes. They were workers fighting inflation, traders negotiating uncertain markets, sailors balancing profit and survival. Vinland was their greatest business gamble. The Viking crossing to North America seems miraculous until one studies the science behind their navigation. Norse seafaring mastery rested not on luck, but on deep environmental knowledge, mathematical intuition, and multi-layered observational systems perfected across generations. Their journey proves not only bravery, it proves intellectual sophistication often underestimated by modern imagination. Longships were technological marvels. Their flexible hulls bent with waves rather than resisting them, reducing structural strain. Vinland, therefore, stands not as isolated fact, but as intersection of cultures, sciences, and stories. It represents global teamwork linking past and future. In the modern world, history no longer belongs solely to textbooks or sagas. It belongs to satellites, genetic laboratories, climate modeling software, and artificial intelligence. Technology revolutionizes our understanding of Vinland, taking the story far beyond what archaeology alone can prove. These scientific tools reveal patterns invisible to early historians, offering deeper understanding into why Vikings reached North America, how they traveled, and why they departed. DNA research plays transformative role. Studies on Icelandic and Greenlandic populations discovered surprising genetic signatures that may indicate distant Native American lineage. Some mitochondrial DNA lines, passed through female ancestry, appear to originate from North American sources dating near the Vinland period, although data remains debated. One theory suggests that a small number of indigenous individuals may have traveled back to Iceland or Greenland with Vikings. If confirmed, this would rewrite human migration understanding, showing that cultural exchange included genetic exchange. Population genetics research also reinforces saga accuracy. By analyzing genetic diversity among Norse settlements, scientists map degrees of mobility. Greenland populations show patterns consistent with maritime voyaging, confirming frequent Atlantic travel. These findings align with Vinland expeditions described in sagas, proving the Norse world was highly connected socially and genetically. Climate research further clarifies the Vinland timeline. Ice core samples from Greenland show precise climate cycles. A warming period occurred around 950 to 1250 CE, providing ideal navigation conditions for westward sailing. This warm era reduced sea ice, opened routes, and encouraged Norse expansion. When climate cooled around 1300 CE, sea ice increased, making Vinland voyages harder. This environmental pattern supports historical theory that Vinland's success was rooted in temporary climate advantage rather than permanent expansion capability. Ocean current modeling offers another layer of evidence. Scientists simulate Norse ship routes using computer mapping and wind pattern data. Simulations show that Viking longships could easily reach Newfoundland using North Atlantic drift currents. Return voyages also match prevailing wind directions, confirming the route was not accidental. This technological validation supports saga accounts describing simple westward detours during routine travel to Greenland. Digital cartography strengthens geographical interpretation. Researchers overlay saga descriptions onto modern satellite maps, comparing coastline shape, river mouths, and island clusters. These analyses strongly support Newfoundland as primary Vinland location, while acknowledging that the term Vinland may have covered wider region. Technology allows historians to visualize Viking journeys rather than simply imagine them. 3D reconstructions of longhouses at Lance AUX Meadows recreate living environments. Virtual reality guides tourists inside ancient Vinland rooms. Educators use these simulations to teach students about Viking living conditions, showing how people cooked, slept, worked, and protected themselves. Digital history brings Vinland alive for global audiences, proving that past knowledge evolves with new storytelling tools. Even internet data reshapes understanding. As amateur historians, drone pilots, and archaeologists share findings, global crowdsourcing accelerates research. Some discoveries, like new potential camp outlines, result from amateur satellite review, not academic investigation. History has expanded beyond academia. It belongs to communities. Technology also challenges assumptions about Indigenous Norse interaction. AI linguistic analysis compares Norse runes and Native American symbols, searching for conceptual overlap. While full translation remains impossible, early models show surprising similarities in carve pattern usage. Such research encourages interdisciplinary cooperation, reducing Eurocentric bias. Finally, digital archives protect Vinland memory. Manuscripts once locked in private European vaults now appear online, allowing scholars in Canada, Scandinavia, and indigenous nations to study them directly. Shared access democratizes truth. Vinland shows that history evolves alongside technology. What was once medieval rumor now stands at frontier of science. The more tools humanity develops, the more complete this story becomes. Through archaeology, genetics, climate science, and digital exploration, Vinland continues revealing itself piece by piece. It confirms something extraordinary. The human story does not end, and discovery continues long after explorers are gone. When people imagine Vikings, they often picture longboats full of armored men wielding axes beneath roaring sea spray. But Viking exploration and settlement efforts, including those in Vinland, did not rely on male energy alone. Women played a crucial but often invisible role, shaping history through domestic organization, cultural continuity, emotional guidance, and political influence. To understand Vinland fully, we must lift the veil that hides women's presence in the saga narrative and reconstruct their contributions through archaeology, storytelling patterns, and Norse cultural customs. The sagas mention women sparingly, but they're always mentioned with significance. For example, sources tell us that Gurur Orbjarnardr traveled to North America with her husband Karlsefni. She was no passive passenger. She became one of the first known European women to set foot on American soil. In fact, she gave birth to a child named Snorri, often recorded as the first European child born in the New World. This event alone places women at the core of the Vinland settlement mission. Snorri's birth symbolized long-term intention. Vikings did not journey to Vinland simply to trade or raid. They traveled to build future generations. That vision depended on women. Women carried Norse culture with them. In longhouses, they oversaw weaving, clothing repair, food storage, and seasonal survival strategies. In Greenland and Iceland, women processed dairy products, preserved fish, tanned hides, and wove sails, skills absolutely necessary for survival and voyage preparation. If women traveled to Vinland, these same tasks followed them. Their work made settlement possible. Even in Vinland's hostile environment, female knowledge mattered deeply. Consider basic survival. Food preparation required caution against spoilage. Clothing needed weather-resistant reinforcement. Injuries demanded herbal remedies. Viking women often served as healers and midwives. In remote settlements, such knowledge saved lives. Without their medical understanding, sickness and injury might have ended the Vinland story before it began. Culturally, women influenced diplomacy. In Norse tradition, female voices sometimes tempered male aggression. The sagas describe women advising restraint or urging men to consider honor beyond battle. Their perspective helped prevent reckless violence. In Vinland, where relationships with indigenous peoples were delicate, such restraint could mean the difference between trade success and war outbreak. When decisions about settlement continuation arose, women discussed safety needs for family and children, pushing men to weigh emotional cost over pride. Archaeological research supports female presence indirectly. Household artifacts found at Lance aux Meadows include textile tools, spindle whorls, needles, and yarn fragments. Although men could weave, women traditionally dominated textile labor. Their presence implies women lived, worked, and influenced life in Vinland. The written texts rarely spotlight them. Women also shaped cultural memory. When explorers returned to Greenland and Iceland, female storytellers retold Vinland tales through song and spoken tradition. Mothers passed memory to children, who then shared stories with grandchildren. Through domestic storytelling circles, Vinland survived centuries of silence after physical settlements ended. Without women, the sagas may have vanished. Guru Rest's later life reveals Vinland's lasting mark. She eventually traveled to Rome, a feat astonishing for a medieval Icelandic woman. Her worldview expanded far beyond homeland coasts. Her journey proves that exploring new lands reshaped personal destiny, not just collective identity. It hints that Vinland may have sparked global imagination in more individuals than saga's record. Thus, when modern people speak of Viking courage, they must speak of women too, because Viking exploration was family endeavor. It relied on trust, partnership, and domestic unity. Without these hidden pillars, no longhouse would stand, no voyage would launch, no settlement would endure. Women were not background figures in Vinland. They were living spirits shaping culture from hearth to horizon. When we imagine Vinland, we often picture adults locked in conflict. But both Viking and Indigenous children lived through this chapter of history. Their experiences remain unstated in written sagas, yet archaeology and anthropology allow us to reconstruct how youth may have reacted to this collision between civilizations. Children offer emotional lens. Where adults saw diplomacy, fear, and land ownership, children saw mystery, wonder, and curiosity. In Norse culture, children were essential to survival. They symbolized continuity, inheritance, and hope. Every Viking family dreamed of raising young not only into adulthood, but into prosperity. Bringing children to Vinland or planning for children to grow, their meant settlers believed in permanent future. Thus, their presence in Vinland tells us that the Norse vision extended beyond trade, beyond profit, toward multi-generational settlement. Imagine Viking children arriving on Vinland's coast. They would have stared wide-eyed at massive forests unlike anything in Iceland or Greenland. They would have tasted berries unknown at home, heard bird calls foreign to their ears, and run barefoot along warmer soil. Vinland would have seemed like fairy tale become real. Even adults described Vinland with awe. How much more intense must it have felt to children, whose imagination held fewer boundaries? But innocence did not protect them from fear. When conflict with indigenous groups emerged, children felt psychological tension. They saw adults whispering and sharpening weapons. They heard human screams echoing at night. They witnessed arrows embedded in walls. Children in Viking society were taught to be strong, to hide fear, to accept hardship as path to adulthood, but trauma still seeped into their bones. Some children formed memories that shaped their entire lives. Snorri, born in Vinland, likely grew up hearing stories of forests and river shores where his parents walked. Returning to Iceland, he stood as living proof that Europeans were capable of thriving in North America, if only briefly. His existence bridged continents. On the indigenous side, children also watched Vikings with curiosity. To them, the Norse were strange, taller, heavily dressed, with pale skin and shining metal. Indigenous children probably whispered questions to elders. Who are these people? Why do they cut trees so fast? Why do they build houses instead of moving with seasons? Adults explained through cultural lenses grounded in ancestral knowledge. Some indigenous children may have been fascinated by Norse tools. Iron blades cut more smooth than stone knives. Bright beads and metal rings looked magical. Yet fascination came with caution. Cultural teaching encouraged children to respect land boundaries and strangers. When conflict erupted, children learned lessons about defending territory and maintaining unity. there's possibility of quiet interaction between young individuals. In early peaceful stages, Viking children and indigenous youth may have watched each other from distance near rivers, silent, curious, uncertain, but perhaps smiling before adults interfered. Human instinct, especially in children, leans toward connection rather than violence. The potential for friendship existed, buried under layers of cultural fear. Children suffered deeply when war escalated. They lived through nights of screaming winds and war drums. Their minds held memories adults rarely recorded. Some lost parents at Silent River or during attacks on the settlement. Trauma shaped their futures long after leaving Vinland. Stories they carried home influenced Icelandic and Greenlandic culture permanently, even though sagas ignore children's emotional worlds. This missing voice reminds historians that Vinland was not just epic saga, it was human experience. Behind every battle stood families. Behind every decision lay concern for the next generation. Children symbolized continuity, which made conflict harder. Adults weighed risk differently because they feared losing their future bloodlines. In an indigenous world, children learned what it meant to defend home. Indigenous children probably whispered questions to elders. Who are these people? Why do they cut trees so fast? Why do they build houses instead of moving with seasons? Adults explained through cultural lenses grounded in ancestral knowledge. Some indigenous children may have been fascinated by Norse tools. Iron blades cut more smooth than stone knives. Bright beads and metal rings looked magical. Yet fascination came with caution. Cultural teaching encouraged children to respect land boundaries and strangers. When conflict erupted, children learned lessons about defending territory and maintaining unity. There's possibility of quiet interaction between young individuals. In early peaceful stages, Viking children and indigenous youth may have watched each other from distance near rivers, silent, curious, uncertain, but perhaps smiling before adults interfered. Human instinct, especially in children, leans toward connection rather than violence. The potential for friendship existed, buried under layers of cultural fear. Children suffered deeply when war escalated. They lived through nights of screaming winds and war drums. Their minds held memories adults rarely recorded. Some lost parents at Silent River or during attacks on the settlement. Trauma shaped their futures long after leaving Vinland. Stories they carried home influenced Icelandic and Greenlandic culture permanently, even though sagas ignore children's emotional worlds. This missing voice reminds historians that Vinland was not just epic saga, it was human experience. Behind every battle stood families. Behind every decision lay concern for the next generation. Children symbolized continuity, which made conflict harder. Adults weighed risk differently because they feared losing their future bloodlines. In an indigenous world, children learned what it meant to defend home. Generations later, their descendants remembered tales of pale warriors from across the sea. Even if details blurred, meaning remained. Strangers came once, challenged the land, and were pushed away. Children on both sides shaped legacy. They inherited trauma, hope, and knowledge. Their memories helped build the emotional truth beneath archaeological evidence. Vinland may be defined by explorers, leaders, and warriors, but its story lives longest through children who carried it forward in silence. To understand Vinland as lived reality rather than myth, we must imagine its daily rhythm. Viking settlers were not always fighting or exploring. They spent most hours working, repairing, cooking, building, sleeping, and thinking. Their lived experience shaped the psychological atmosphere that led to eventual departure. Each day in Vinland revealed triumph, beauty, hardship, and cultural exhaustion. Housing represented first major task. Vikings built turf-walled buildings reinforced by timber beams, similar to Icelandic longhouses. These structures protected them from wind, rain, and cold air from the sea. The houses contained central fire pits for warmth and cooking. Thick smoke clung to clothing and skin. Light filtered dimly through door openings, creating orange glow at dawn and dusk. Inside, sleeping arrangements were communal. Families rested on raised platforms lined with furs. Privacy did not exist. Night sounds, snores, whispers, wind rattling wooden walls became background music. Children curled against parents. Warriors slept with weapons nearby, especially once conflict began. Food defined morale. At first, abundance seemed miraculous. Wild grapes, salmon rivers, and forests full of game. For Vikings accustomed to Greenland scarcity, Vinland's resources felt like blessing. They dried fish, smoked meat, gathered berries, and made broths. But as settlement stress grew, food gained emotional weight. Shared meals united families, but rationing broke spirits. Hunger whispered fears about survival and returning home. Work consumed daylight. Men hunted and built new structures, repaired boats, sharpened blades, and hauled lumber. Women cooked, stitched clothing, crafted ropes, and tended fires. Everyone collected firewood. Daily life had no luxury. Every task ensured next day's survival. Religion added meaning. Viking settlers combined Christian prayer with pagan tradition. Some placed rune stones near homes. Others carved crucifixes. Evening gatherings included storytelling, music, and sagas. These moments bonded community, easing mental strain. But emotional realities were heavy. Young men longed for Greenland freedom. Women missed extended family. Isolation weighed on minds. Each person lived under constant awareness that they stood far from home, surrounded by cultural difference. Indigenous presence, even during peace, reminded settlers they were guests. Psychological fatigue shaped routine. Every creek and forest became potential threat. Work outside settlement required group travel. Hunting parties walked silently, scanning trees for movement. Children learned early not to wander. Weather challenged them too. Though warmer than Greenland, Vinland's storm systems were unpredictable. Rainstorms drenched houses, strong winds battered roofs. Salt air corroded metal faster than expected. Repair became endless cycle. Despite hardship, settlers found joy. They marveled at animals unknown in Greenland. They carved wooden toys for children. They held feasts using grapes and wild honey. Women sang lullabies that fused old melodies with new surroundings. Some settlers fell in love with Vinland's soil, believing it more beautiful than any homeland. But daily fatigue wore away idealism. The settlement never became fully self-sustaining. Timber-rich though it was, Vinland lacked Nordic social infrastructure. Law councils, trading stations, religious centers. Life felt temporary. This daily reality explains why settlers left. War alone did not push them away. Exhaustion did. Building a world meant carrying mental weight, and Vinland's weight grew heavier each season. Through imagined daily life, we see truth. Vinland was not only battlefield or legend. It was home for a short time, filled with laughter, tears, routines, and dreams. That complexity makes the Viking legacy deeper than exploration alone. To understand Vinland beyond dates, voyages, and artifacts, we must examine the inner psychology of the people who crossed harsh oceans in wooden ships. The Viking discovery of North America was not merely physical expansion, it was emotional expansion. The men and women who sailed westward confronted the deepest layers of human longing. The desire to belong, the hunger for meaning, and the instinct to survive beyond limitation. Their journey illuminates an essential truth about humanity. We are shaped by emotional storms as much as by historical events. Vikings who joined Leif Erikson's expedition carried psychological motivations rooted in their society. Norse culture valued courage, exploration, and honor. Young Icelandic and Greenlandic men grew up listening to sagas about heroes who traveled through unknown territories to earn glory. Their minds were filled with stories of Odin wandering the world in disguise, and Thor challenging giants at distant boundaries. When rumors of Western lands spread, imagination exploded. Some believed venturing toward Vinland would place them in saga history themselves. That desire alone created powerful internal pressure. But ambition was only one force. Economic need played equally large psychological role. Greenland, though beautiful, offered limited farmland and timber. Winter starvation haunted families every year. The promise of Vinland, rich in resources, represented emotional relief. Knowing a better life might exist across the water created hope strong enough to overcome terrifying fear. Their shallow draft allowed landings nearly anywhere: river mouths, open beaches, narrow fjords. Ships were dual-motored. Oars provided control during calm winds. Square sails captured power during storms. Viking carpentry perfected clinker-built planking technique, overlapping with layers forming light, strong frame. This engineering made westward crossing feasible. But ships alone do not reach continents. Navigation does. Norse navigators understood North Atlantic wind patterns. They used knowledge of seasonal direction changes. Spring winds blew west toward Greenland. Autumn winds blew east toward Norway. They recognized cloud formation around distant land masses. When clouds formed uniquely above Greenland's icy mountains, sailors steered toward that signal long before visual sighting occurred. They also relied on celestial navigation. Sunstones, crystals like Iceland spar, may have served as polarization filters, helping sailors locate sun through cloud cover. This technique, though debated, aligns with Icelandic sagas describing sun-finding stones. Combined with daily sun path memory, these tools allowed latitude estimation. Skilled navigators could maintain course westward for days, even without horizon clarity. Observing birds offered additional data. Before landfall, crews released ravens trained to search for coastlines. If ravens flew homeward, land remained distant. If they flew away and did not return, sailors followed their direction. This biological compass doubled as psychological comfort. Animal presence reduced mental isolation at sea. Ocean currents also guided longships. Norse mariners understood North Atlantic drift behavior based on experience with fishing voyages. They recognized that currents pulled northeast near Iceland, then carried ships southwest near Greenland. Knowledge passed orally, sailor to sailor, creating mental maps. It is easy today to underestimate the psychological courage needed to climb into a longship and sail toward nothing but horizon line. But Vikings felt fear acutely. Fear of storms that could swallow ships whole. Fear of sea monsters imagined beneath waves. Fear of disappointing families. Fear of death without burial near ancestors. The difference was not absence of fear. It was mastery over fear. Religion influenced mindset too. The Viking worldview was transitioning from paganism to Christianity, creating inner tension within individuals. Pagan faith taught that life was a cycle of destiny, that glory after death outweighed physical survival. Christianity taught compassion, repentance, and spiritual salvation. Inside the minds of Vinland explorers, these belief systems intertwined. Crossing the ocean became pilgrimage and test simultaneously. If they succeeded, fate smiled. If they died, they believed heaven or Valhalla waited. Such belief allowed people to justify enormous risk. Intercultural contact affected emotional identity as well. Encountering indigenous peoples changed Norse self-image dramatically. Vikings arrived expecting superiority. Their society emphasized warfare skill and physical strength. But in Vinland, they met groups equally skilled in archery, movement, and environmental knowledge. Facing opponents who fought differently, not with shield walls, but silent ambush and guerrilla tactics, created psychological instability. Some Vikings admired indigenous skill secretly, realizing their own methods were limited. Others felt fear so deep they masked it with anger. Homesickness layered onto this mental landscape. No matter how beautiful Vinland was, settlers missed familiar mountains, fjords, and community networks. They missed laughter around winter fires in Greenland, hearing seals bark by the shore, breathing air filled with family memory. For many settlers, ocean horizon became an emotional barrier. They lived daily knowing home lay weeks of dangerous sailing away. Leadership psychology also influenced survival. Leif Erikson carried anxiety no saga fully describes, the weight of responsibility. Every death in Vinland haunted him. Every decision created ripple effect. Leaders slept lightly, thinking constantly about diplomacy, defense, and morale. Such burden strained the spirit. While sagas portray Leif as hero, beneath confidence must have existed loneliness, knowing no one else could decide fate of settlement. Internal group pressure shaped social emotion too. Not all settlers agreed with leadership or settlement strategy. Some believed they should fight aggressively. Others wanted peaceful coexistence. These ideological divisions fractured confidence. Viking society valued strong debate, but disagreement in foreign territory intensified psychological stress. Finally, emotional trauma arose from witnessing death far from homeland. Vikings did not fear death conceptually, but death without ritual burial was terrifying. When warriors were killed by arrows and buried near forest edges rather than beneath family stones, their spirits felt unresolved. Survivors carried guilt, grief, and helplessness, emotions rarely recorded in sagas, yet unavoidable in real life. Psychology reveals Vinland was not just epic voyage. It was human struggle for identity, belonging, and meaning. Behind armor and axes were hearts beating fast, minds full of conflicted dreams, and spirits shaped by longing that transcended fear. Spiritual meaning defined how Viking communities processed the Vinland story, both during exploration and after settlement collapse. The Norse worldview was inseparable from myth, faith, and sacred understanding of nature. For them, Vinland was not just distant soil. It was spiritual frontier. It represented doorway into a world unknown to gods and ancestors alike. Understanding Vinland requires examining how belief systems shaped interpretation of events, emotions, and memory. Traditional pagan beliefs framed exploration as cosmic journey. Odin symbolized wisdom gained through wandering. His mythic journeys across worlds suggested that travel transformed soul and identity. Many Norse settlers believed gods guided their ships through storms. Storm winds were not random. They were messages. Thunder was Thor's hammer, clearing paths across ocean sky. Sea creatures, whether real or imagined, reflected Jormungandr, the world's serpent guarding boundaries. Therefore, when Vikings saw whales breach beside longships, they interpreted them as signs that the ocean approved their mission. Vinland's forests held spiritual resonance. Pagans believed trees carried ancestral voices. In Greenland, trees were scarce. In Vinland, they surrounded settlers like living guardians. Some believed the forest spoke. Quiet morning winds rustling through leaves created atmosphere of sacred presence. This may explain why initial encounters felt peaceful. Settlers interpreted environment as blessing rather than threat. Indigenous presence complicated spiritual ideas. Vikings believed land spirits could be protective or hostile. When conflict began, many assumed Vinland spirits resisted them. Some whispered that the land did not want Norse settlement. This spiritual fear magnified physical danger. Warriors who were fearless against men trembled at thought of angry earth gods. Christian settlers interpreted Vinland differently. They saw new land as gift from God, perhaps promised land where Christian communities could flourish. Some priests urged evangelization of indigenous peoples, believing faith would unite cultures. For Christian families, the first European child born in Vinland symbolized hope, proof that Christ's world extended beyond Europe. It represented doorway into a world unknown to gods and ancestors alike. Understanding Vinland requires examining how belief systems shaped interpretation of events, emotions, and memory. Traditional pagan beliefs framed exploration as cosmic journey. Odin symbolized wisdom gained through wandering. His mythic journeys across worlds suggested that travel transformed soul and identity. Many Norse settlers believed gods guided their ships through storms. Storm winds were not random. They were messages. Thunder was Thor's hammer, clearing paths across ocean sky. Sea creatures, whether real or imagined, reflected Jormungandr, the world's serpent guarding boundaries. Therefore, when Vikings saw whales breach beside longships, they interpreted them as signs that the ocean approved their mission. Vinland's forests held spiritual resonance. Pagans believed trees carried ancestral voices. In Greenland, trees were scarce. In Vinland, they surrounded settlers like living guardians. Some believed the forest spoke. Quiet morning winds rustling through leaves created atmosphere of sacred presence. This may explain why initial encounters felt peaceful. Settlers interpreted environment as blessing rather than threat. Indigenous presence complicated spiritual ideas. Vikings believed land spirits could be protective or hostile. When conflict began, many assumed Vinland spirits resisted them. Some whispered that the land did not want Norse settlement. This spiritual fear magnified physical danger. Warriors who were fearless against men trembled at thought of angry earth gods. Christian settlers interpreted Vinland differently. They saw new land as gift from God, perhaps promised land where Christian communities could flourish. Some priests urged evangelization of indigenous peoples, believing faith would unite cultures. For Christian families, the first European child born in Vinland symbolized hope, proof that Christ's world extended beyond Europe. They believed God placed them there for divine purpose. But when war erupted, Christian meaning changed. Some saw conflict as test of faith, God challenging settlers through adversity. Others interpreted defeat as punishment for violence or mixed pagan practices. Returning home, Christian clergy framed Vinland as a moral parable, proof that God reveals world not for conquest, but for wisdom. Over centuries, spiritual retelling reshaped sagas. Pagan imagery fused with Christian philosophy. Leif became Leif the Lucky, fate-touched explorer. Thorvald became martyr-like figure, dying beneath rain of arrows. Grur, who later traveled to Rome, became symbol of feminine spiritual resilience. Myth grows when truth merges with symbol, and Vinland myths grew endlessly. Norwegian storytellers imagined Vinland as land immune to winter because gods blessed it. Icelandic poets described Vinland rivers glowing silver in moonlight. Greenlanders believed Vinland spirits protected ships sailing near western waters. Oral memory wove symbolism through daily speech. Fishermen warned children to behave, or Vinland ghosts would come in fog. Storytellers used Vinland to teach humility. Even the strongest cannot conquer destiny. Eventually, Vinland shifted from personal story to cultural myth. It represented dreamland beyond reach, proof of Viking bravery, evidence that world contained infinite wonder, reminder that violence destroys dreams, symbol of human curiosity. Spiritual interpretation ensured Vinland never faded from northern memory. When physical settlement died, myth settlement grew stronger. Myth allowed people to rewrite painful memories into lessons. It softened trauma and strengthened identity. Thus, Vinland became spiritual homeland, a land Vikings carried inside soul even after ships returned to Greenland. The Viking journey to North America created emotional imprint that shaped Scandinavian identity long after the physical settlement ended. Even when Greenland colonies vanished and Iceland fell into hardship, Vinland remained symbol of greatness. Emotional memory, collective psychological inheritance, preserved Vinland more powerfully than written history ever could. Throughout centuries, Norse descendants told Vinland stories during harsh winters to inspire survival. In long nights when storms shook wooden homes, families reminded one another, our ancestors crossed the ocean. We can endure anything. Vinland became mental anchor. It proved Nordic people belonged among great explorers of world history. Even without kingdoms or empires, Scandinavians carried pride that their ancestors reached America first. During medieval and early modern eras, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland lived under shifting political pressure. Cultural independence often wavered. Economic struggle persisted. Vinland stories empowered identity in times of weakness. They encouraged belief that Scandinavian heritage contained unique bravery unmatched by European rivals. In 19th century, when Norway pursued independence from Sweden, nationalists revived Viking history to build pride. Vinland became centerpiece. Artists painted Leif Erikson guiding longships toward golden shores. Poets called Vinland the Western Dream. In Iceland, where cultural isolation shaped national spirit, Vinland confirmed that Icelanders came from unstoppable people. Many said, if Iceland is small, our history is not. Emotional memory also shaped diaspora identity. Scandinavian immigrants settling in United States and Canada during 1800s looked upon North American landscape and whispered, "We have returned." For them, Vinland was ancestral homeland rediscovered through migration. Statues of Leif Erikson rose across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, visible proof that Nordic history belonged to American soil too. The Viking journey to North America created an emotional imprint that shaped Scandinavian identity long after the physical settlement ended. Even when Greenland colonies vanished and Iceland fell into hardship, Vinland remained a symbol of greatness. Emotional memory, collective psychological inheritance, preserved Vinland more powerfully than written history ever could. Throughout centuries, Norse descendants told Vinland stories during harsh winters to inspire survival. In long nights when storms shook wooden homes, families reminded one another, our ancestors crossed the ocean. We can endure anything. Vinland became mental anchor. It proved Nordic people belonged among great explorers of world history. Even without kingdoms or empires, Scandinavians carried pride that their ancestors reached America first. During medieval and early modern eras, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland lived under shifting political pressure. Cultural independence often wavered. Economic struggle persisted. Vinland stories empowered identity in times of weakness. They encouraged belief that Scandinavian heritage contained unique bravery unmatched by European rivals. In 19th century, when Norway pursued independence from Sweden, nationalists revived Viking history to build pride. Vinland became centerpiece. Artists painted Leif Erikson guiding longships toward golden shores. Poets called Vinland the Western Dream. In Iceland, where cultural isolation shaped national spirit, Vinland confirmed that Icelanders came from unstoppable people. Many said, if Iceland is small, our history is not. Emotional memory also shaped diaspora identity. Scandinavian immigrants settling in United States and Canada during 1800s looked upon North American landscape and whispered, "We have returned." For them, Vinland was ancestral homeland rediscovered through migration. Statues of Leif Erikson rose across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, visible proof that Nordic history belonged to American soil too. Psychologically, Vinland validated cultural pride free from war violence. Vikings before Vinland were known for brutality, but Vikings of Vinland were known for exploration. This shift softened Scandinavian identity, shaping modern view of Vikings not merely as raiders, but as world travelers, traders, and thinkers. Educationally, Vinland shaped Scandinavian academic ambition. Icelandic universities preserved sagas for centuries. Scholars defended saga accuracy even when Europe doubted them. Their persistence paid off when archaeology proved truth. That validation created cultural triumph, proof that small island nation preserved massive historical fact. Emotionally, Vinland embodied longing for lost opportunity. Many Scandinavians wondered what world might look like if Vikings had remained in America. This dream inspired novels, poems, and national pride. Rather than regret, it fostered hopeful imagination. Vinland also became an emotional bridge between Scandinavians and indigenous North Americans. Modern historians promote mutual respect, acknowledging conflict without erasing humanity. Emotional memory now encourages empathy, not superiority. In global imagination, Vinland stands as symbol that human achievement is not limited by geography, era, or technology. It proves courage matters more than empire. For over 1,000 years, Vinland has shaped Scandinavian character. Pride without arrogance, hope without fantasy, courage without cruelty, history without borders. That emotional legacy may be Vinland's greatest gift, reminding world that identity grows not only from what we conquer, but from what we dare to dream. The Viking voyage to North America stands among the greatest achievements of ancient navigation, but to appreciate its true meaning, we must place it alongside other exploration traditions that shaped world history. Psychologically, Vinland validated cultural pride free from war violence. Vikings before Vinland were known for brutality, but Vikings of Vinland were known for exploration. This shift softened Scandinavian identity, shaping modern view of Vikings not merely as raiders, but as world travelers, traders, and thinkers. Educationally, Vinland shaped Scandinavian academic ambition. Icelandic universities preserved sagas for centuries. Scholars defended saga accuracy even when Europe doubted them. Their persistence paid off when archaeology proved truth. That validation created cultural triumph, proof that small island nation preserved massive historical fact. Emotionally, Vinland embodied longing for lost opportunity. Many Scandinavians wondered what world might look like if Vikings had remained in America. This dream inspired novels, poems, and national pride. Rather than regret, it fostered hopeful imagination. Vinland also became an emotional bridge between Scandinavians and indigenous North Americans. Modern historians promote mutual respect, acknowledging conflict without erasing humanity. Emotional memory now encourages empathy, not superiority. In global imagination, Vinland stands as symbol that human achievement is not limited by geography, era, or technology. It proves courage matters more than empire. For over 1,000 years, Vinland has shaped Scandinavian character. Pride without arrogance, hope without fantasy, courage without cruelty, history without borders. That emotional legacy may be Vinland's greatest gift, reminding world that identity grows not only from what we conquer, but from what we dare to dream. The Viking voyage to North America stands among the greatest achievements of ancient navigation, but to appreciate its true meaning, we must place it alongside other exploration traditions that shaped world history. Doing so reveals both similarities and profound differences between cultures that look toward oceans not with fear, but with curiosity and ambition. Vikings, Polynesians, Phoenicians, Chinese mariners, and indigenous American canoe navigators all crossed vast waters long before modern instruments. Yet each culture approached exploration through unique motivations, technologies, philosophies, and spiritual teachings. Vinland's story belongs to this global tapestry. First, the Vikings. They sailed long ships, sleek, fast, shallow-keeled vessels capable of navigating both deep sea and shallow rivers. Their maritime skills evolved from centuries of coastal raiding, trade, and settlement across the North Atlantic. They pushed westward from Norway to the Shetlands, then Iceland, then Greenland, and finally Vinland. Their expansion had rhythm. Move to new land, hunt and farm, build communities, adapt to climate, and then venture farther. Viking exploration was a fusion of necessity and cultural identity. Scarce farmland in Scandinavia pushed families outward. Survival and ambition braided together. Compare this to Polynesian voyagers, who crossed the Pacific long before Vikings crossed the Atlantic. Polynesians spread from Taiwan into Oceania using outrigger canoes guided by sophisticated star path systems. They charted wind direction, ocean swell, bird migration, and cloud reflection to locate islands thousands of miles apart. Vikings steered using the sun, stars, and coastal orientation, but Polynesians read entire oceans like maps inside their minds. Their cultural worldview embraced ocean as living entity, ancestor spirit rather than threat. Vikings respected the sea, but feared it. Polynesians embraced it as permanent home. Yet both cultures transformed ocean into highway. Phoenicians, sailing Mediterranean waters centuries before Vikings, built maritime trade networks linking Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Their achievements in navigation influenced Greek and Roman exploration later. Unlike Vikings, Phoenicians rarely settled distant colonies outside Mediterranean. Instead, they focused on ports and trade hubs. Their voyages prioritized wealth and diplomacy rather than farmland and community creation. Vikings expanded through settlement, Phoenicians through commerce. Chinese exploration also offers meaningful contrast. During the Ming Dynasty, Admiral Zheng, he commanded treasure fleets larger than anything Viking shipbuilders could imagine. Massive nine-masted vessels crossing the Indian Ocean to Africa centuries after Vinland. Chinese voyages represented state-organized demonstration of wealth and science, not frontier survival. Vikings, by contrast, traveled without imperial backing, guided only by community leadership and cultural daring. They sailed into the unknown not to display power, but to build new lives. Indigenous American seafaring deserves equal recognition. Long before Vikings arrived in Vinland, indigenous groups of the Arctic, Pacific Northwest, and Caribbean mastered canoe navigation. Inuit Umiaks, Tlingit ocean canoes, and Caribbean war canoes traveled faster and farther than many European vessels of the same period. These societies maintained active maritime trade networks long before Norse contact. Vikings did not discover empty coastlines. They encountered civilizations already shaped by oceanic skill and regional knowledge. By comparing these traditions, we see that Viking expansion fits a larger pattern. Human cultures exploring edges of world to test identity. Vinland stands out because it bridged two continental civilizations separated by thousands of years of geography and cultural divergence. Polynesians never met Norsemen. Phoenicians never reached North America. Chinese fleets turned back from Africa. Yet Vikings, against odds, stepped into Western Hemisphere. Vinland also carried symbolic contrast. Polynesian settlement succeeded spectacularly. Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand became lasting homelands. Viking settlement in Vinland, however, ultimately failed, not due to weakness, but because larger environmental, cultural, and logistical forces opposed permanent occupation. Thus, the Viking reach to North America does not stand alone. It reflects universal human story. When we frame Vikings beside great exploration civilizations, Vinland becomes part of shared human achievement rather than isolated European triumph. It shows that discovery culture existed around the globe, driven by human instinct long before maps drew boundaries between continents. To fully understand Vinland, we must examine the civilizations flourishing across North America during the period of Norse visitation. Vinland often gets portrayed like a remote wilderness, but this perspective misleads. When Vikings arrived, North America contained millions of people living in structured societies with spiritual systems, government forms, agricultural networks, and trade routes stretching thousands of miles. Norse contact touched one edge of an immense cultural web. Although Vikings landed in northeast coastal space, indigenous civilizations across the continent shaped the environment indirectly. The woodland and Mississippian societies in the eastern woodlands were constructing mound cities such as Cahokia, a metropolis near modern St. Louis, with population rivaling European capitals in the 11th century. Cahokia housed astronomers, political elites, musicians, farmers, and warriors. It featured temples, plazas, and complex trade systems reaching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. In the same century, Vikings struggled for survival in Vinland. Mississippian farmers built monumental architecture with astronomical alignment. Farther north, Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples formed sophisticated social alliances. They practiced agriculture, cultivating maize and beans, which supported dense population. These cultures carried diplomatic traditions involving councils, ceremonial exchanges, and storytelling frameworks more advanced than anything Norse Europe had seen. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, though formalized later, drew from deep-rooted philosophies already circulating in the region. In the Arctic, Inuit and Dorset peoples navigated ice landscapes with unmatched skill. Their kayaks and umiaks allowed long-distance coastal journeys. They used harpoons designed through centuries of refinement, far more efficient in icy waters than Viking spears. Norse visitors in Greenland and Arctic Canada interacted with these northern cultures, resulting in trade, conflict, and perhaps intermarriage. Meanwhile, across the Southwest, ancestral Puebloan societies constructed cliff dwellings and irrigation infrastructures that rivaled European engineering. Their astronomy, architecture, and pottery represent intellectual brilliance. Though far from Vinland region, their existence challenges European-centric narratives. The continent the Vikings reached was not empty, primitive, or unstructured. It was a vast landscape of nations. Understanding this context shifts historical interpretation. Vikings did not encounter isolated groups. They met people connected to cultural networks rooted deeply in the land. Indigenous traders carried shells, copper, minerals, and stories across long distances. It is possible that Viking presence in Newfoundland quickly transmitted as rumor from one group to another. Culturally, indigenous societies valued oral history, environmental knowledge, and communal decision-making. Their governance systems were not monarchies like those in Europe. Instead, leadership came through consensus, balanced power structures that allowed women, elders, and gifted orders to influence decision. Indigenous tribes were not inherently hostile. They defended homeland only after provocation. Both sides acted logically within cultural frameworks. Thus, peace did exist, briefly, beautifully, precariously. It was lost not because cultures were incompatible, but because trust lacked time to deepen. Had more generations passed, perhaps bilingual children might have emerged, mixing Norse and indigenous language. Perhaps intermarriage might have created hybrid communities, linking Atlantic worlds centuries before colonization. But cold climates, economic decline, limited population, and mutual fear ended dream. Vinland peace was seed that never reached spring, yet its memory teaches humanity that contact does not guarantee conquest. Sometimes, strangers can speak without swords, if only long enough to understand. Once the physical Vinland settlements faded from living memory, the story of Norse exploration did not disappear. It transformed. Across Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and eventually North America, the Vinland story evolved through folk memory, oral poetry, festival traditions, and legendary exaggeration. What had once been a human story of endurance, contact, and retreat became mythic framework shaping cultural imagination. To understand Vinland as living history, we must examine how myth-making preserved truth while also expanding and reshaping it. In Iceland, where sagas were valued as the backbone of cultural identity, Vinland narratives survived because community memory remained oral long before written manuscripts existed. Families retold the journeys of Leif, Thorvald, Karlsefni, and Garur during winter storytelling nights inside turf-roofed halls. These tales evolved with each generation, taking on dramatic shape. Storms became more violent, indigenous warriors more supernatural, Viking courage more heroic. Oral memory tends to intensify emotional elements while preserving core geography and names. Thus, Vinland lived as half-legend even before scribes inked it onto vellum. As Christianity reshaped Scandinavian belief systems, Vinland stories absorbed moral meaning. Priests used the westward voyage as metaphor for spiritual pilgrimage, teaching that God guides those who walk into unknown darkness. Proverbs appeared. The West shows faith, the East shows fear. Sailors who returned alive were said to be shielded by guardian angels rather than luck alone. Vinland became narrative canvas, blending pagan glory with Christian devotion. Meanwhile, folklore developed supernatural elements around Vinland itself. Some storytellers insisted Vinland existed between worlds, like bridge between Midgard and lands beyond ocean's edge. Others believed spirits of the sea protected it, allowing only courageous hearts to reach shore. Some versions imagined Vinland as paradise where eternal summer sunshine warmed berry fields. These fantasies grew because Vinland represented emotional longing, the dream of better land beyond hardship. In Greenlandic folk memory, Vinland held even stronger significance. It symbolized chance for escape from harsh reality. During difficult winters, older generations whispered to children, "Our ancestors touched the warm world. Remember that when frost bites your bones." For them, Vinland became mythical reassurance, proof that nature could be generous somewhere, if not here. Myth also shaped villains. Indigenous peoples were sometimes distorted into giants or forest spirits in medieval European imagination, not because Europeans believed these people were monsters, but because imagination transforms distant, unknown cultures into archetypes. Fortunately, sagas preserved some realism. Indigenous peoples were described with respect, skill, and individuality, not as fantasy creatures. Still, popular storytelling often drifted into exaggeration. Poetry shaped the story further. Icelandic skalds composed verses honoring Leif Erikson, calling him Ocean Star Navigator and Breaker of Western Silence. These poetic titles lifted him to heroic status far beyond text descriptions. Karlsefni became symbol of endurance. Gurur became embodiment of feminine exploration spirit, her travels redefining gender possibility in medieval worldview. Legends also spread outside Scandinavia. In Scotland and Ireland, sailors spoke of islands to the west said to be inhabited by spirits or lost monks. Some historians speculate these tales may be distortions of Vinland rumor. Across medieval Europe, west became direction of wonder. Storytellers filled blank space with hope. Even after sagas were written and preserved in 13th century manuscripts, folk stories continued mutating. Traveling poets carried tales into villages far from ocean, reshaping details to local taste. Vinland grew as symbol of unreachable reward, land of plenty that only greatest people could see. The more distance grew between event and retelling, the more myth replaced memory. And yet, beneath mythic layering, truth persisted. Vikings reached a new continent. They met new cultures. They built houses there. They returned alive to tell story. Myths wrapped around these bones, but bones remained strong. Folk memory ensured that Vinland would never die, even during centuries when Europe forgot sagas. And when archaeology rediscovered proof in 20th century, these myths regained purpose, not falsehoods, but cultural bridges between ancient truth and modern pride. In the modern world, Vinland has found new life, not only through academic study, but through popular culture, creative media, social identity, and public festivals. Today, Vinland appears in books, movies, video games, comics, classroom curriculum, museum exhibits, and even local tourism branding. Each representation reshapes the narrative for modern audiences, preserving history through entertainment while sometimes distorting facts. One of the most widely recognized fictional representations is the manga and anime series Vinland Saga. Although highly dramatized and set mostly in Europe, it draws emotional strength from real Norse voyages and uses Vinland as symbol of peace, a faraway land representing hope beyond violence. Millions who never studied Viking history learned the word Vinland through this series, proving cultural longevity. Hollywood has touched the theme as well. Films about Vikings occasionally reference North America, though rarely with accuracy. Yet the concept of Vikings reaching America has become a familiar marker in storytelling. Children's media, including cartoons, show longships sailing past whales toward mysterious western lands. These images plant curiosity early and make the subject emotionally accessible. Literature plays an enormous role too. Historical novels, both Nordic and American, explore Vinland from diverse angles: romantic, tragic, realistic, fantastical. Authors build character-driven narratives around indigenous encounters, Viking family drama, and cultural misunderstanding. Though fictional, these stories deepen emotional empathy and make historical context vivid. Museums around the world now display Vinland content. In Newfoundland, Lance-aux Meadows Historic Site offers reconstructed Norse buildings, letting visitors walk inside longhouses shaped by archaeological precision. In Iceland, saga museums teach Vinland through interactive exhibits. Scandinavian cultural centers in the United States celebrate Leif Erikson Day each October 9th, honoring immigrant connection to Viking ancestors. Statues of Leif stand proudly across American cities, including Boston, Chicago, Seattle, and Milwaukee. Education systems increasingly integrate Vinland. Classrooms teach that Columbus was not first European in Americas, correcting outdated history. Teachers use Vinland as gateway topic to discuss Indigenous rights, colonial understanding, and historical revision. Students debate cultural bias in sagas and archaeology, learning critical thinking alongside historical fact. Universities offer specialized research projects analyzing Norse settlement patterns, trade networks, and DNA evidence. Festivals add another dimension. Modern Viking reenactment groups gather at public events wearing historical clothing, forging metal tools, and demonstrating shipbuilding skills. Some events recreate mock negotiations between Norse and Indigenous interpreters, honoring cultural respect. These festivals show Vinland not as mythic fantasy, but as shared human heritage. Digital media expands Vinland's reach. YouTube hosts documentaries analyzing navigation tactics and artifacts from Lance-aux Meadows. Video creators experiment with digital Viking ship simulations. Online genealogy platforms allow Scandinavian descendants to explore potential genetic links to Greenland settlers and, controversially, to indigenous populations. Video games play a role too. Titles featuring open-world exploration include Viking characters sailing westward in search of Vinland, blending fantasy with historical inspiration. While not academically precise, these games nurture fascination for archaeology and adventure. Modern art reflects Vinland's symbolism. Paintings of longships beneath Aurora Borealis, sculptures inspired by rune stones, music albums referencing Western voyages. For Scandinavian musicians, Vinland culture expresses ancestral pride. For North American Indigenous artists, it represents moment of contact and cultural resilience. Even tourism follows myth. Some businesses claim Viking artifacts on beaches that never held Norse presence. The public loves mystery, but scholars warn against sensational claims. The challenge lies in keeping Vinland separated from conspiracy theories. True history deserves careful respect, not reckless exaggeration. Despite entertainment distortions, Vinland pop culture contributes positively. It ensures Viking history remains visible. It introduces younger generations to archaeology. It encourages cross-cultural empathy. It reminds global society that truth evolves. So long as creators acknowledge indigenous perspectives and avoid glorifying conquest, Vinland stories will continue inspiring millions, proving that history's pulse beats strongest when it reaches people emotionally, not just academically. Today, over 1,000 years after Leif Erikson set foot on North American soil, Vinland remains a powerful symbol that continues shaping modern identity and global reflection. Its meaning stretches across cultures. To Scandinavians, it represents achievement and courage. To indigenous peoples, it represents early defense of homeland. To historians, it represents correction of Eurocentric myth. And to humanity as whole, it represents proof that boundaries are illusions created by limited imagination. For descendants of Vikings, Vinland offers heritage of pride, but a pride that evolved into responsibility. Modern Scandinavians recognize that exploration history must be understood ethically. Vinland is no longer simple tale of glory, it is lesson in coexistence. Norwegian and Icelandic scholars collaborate with indigenous communities in Canada to interpret archaeology respectfully, ensuring that no culture claims exclusive ownership of truth. This cooperation contrasts sharply with colonial attitudes of later centuries, proving that history can guide healing rather than division. For indigenous peoples, Vinland stands as a reminder that resistance existed long before European empires rose. Their ancestors successfully defended territory against technologically advanced outsiders, rare reversal in global history where colonizers did not conquer. This truth challenges stereotypes and strengthens modern indigenous identity. They were not discovered. They met invaders with strength. Their relationship to land endured across millennia. Vinland also influences global education. Students learn that world history is interconnected. Vikings did not stand isolated in northern fog. They belonged to a global network of explorers. Learning Vinland corrects false narratives that only Mediterranean or Western European civilizations shaped world boundaries. It forces historians to update maps mentally and physically, placing Norse settlement alongside Chinese trade routes, Polynesian voyages, and African migrations. Vinland supports modern tourism and local economies. Newfoundland communities near Lance aux Meadows celebrate heritage while balancing preservation needs. Visitors arrive seeking Viking experience, but they leave understanding deeper truth about early North American diversity. Emotionally, Vinland addresses timeless human theme, longing for better world. The Vikings sailed west because they dreamed of richer soil, warmer seasons, and easier life. That longing echoes today. Modern people also seek escape from stress, from conflict, from uncertainty. Vinland becomes metaphor for personal dreams. Somewhere beyond current shore lies chance for renewal. But Vinland also warns about dangerous nostalgia. Vikings believed new land would solve old problems. Yet problems followed them. Fear, hunger, cultural conflict. The story teaches that external change cannot erase internal struggle. Humanity must evolve within to survive beyond. Vinland reminds world that history is complex. Europeans reached America long before Columbus, yet this did not lead to massive colonization. Why? Because world timing must align with technology, economy, diplomacy, and culture. History moves like tide, not straight line. Vinland encourages humility toward the past. Perhaps the most beautiful modern meaning lies in unity across oceans. Scandinavians celebrate their ancestors' bravery. Americans honor native resistance and survival. Researchers work together across continents to preserve archaeological sites. Instead of dividing cultures, Vinland connects them. Every year, thousands visit replicas of Norse longships, hearing wind whistle through sails. Children touch carved wood and imagine ancient worlds. Adults walk paths where Vikings once walked and realize that human footsteps echo forever. And the greatest truth rises. Vinland proves humanity is not separated by geography. We are travelers on same planet, shaped by curiosity stronger than fear. The Vikings looked west not to conquer world, but to understand it. Today, we look back to Vinland not to glorify past, but to learn. Vinland continues because people continue. Its story breathes through us. And as long as humans dream of horizons beyond sight, Vinland will remain alive, guiding imagination like lighthouse carved into memory. Today, we learned the full, breathtaking story of the Viking discovery of North America. We saw how Leif Erikson and his people crossed the most dangerous ocean of their time, driven by curiosity, hunger, ambition, and hope. We watched a settlement rise in Vinland, full of life, work, farming, iron production, and dreams of future generations. We also learned how peace slowly turned to conflict. We saw how cultural misunderstanding, fear, and land ownership differences led to war between Vikings and indigenous peoples. And in the end, we watched Vinland collapse, not because of weakness, but because the Norse world could not survive so far from its support networks. From this history, we take powerful lessons. Courage opens new worlds. The Vikings reached America because they dared. Cultures must understand one another, or fear will destroy potential friendship. Human survival depends on cooperation, not conquest. And history is never finished. Truth waits beneath the soil until someone digs it out. Vinland is proof that the world has always been bigger than we believe. It shows that our ancestors were explorers, thinkers, survivors, and dreamers. Thank you for listening to this journey here on History Teller YT. If you enjoyed this story, remember, there are many more waiting. Stay with the channel for future histories, ancient empires, lost civilizations, forgotten warriors, and stories the world has nearly erased. Until next time, keep imagining, keep questioning, keep traveling through time. This is History Teller YT, signing off for today. But don't forget to return. Because history never ends here. Their memory-based mapping system, called sailing directions, listed landmarks, distances between islands, and seasonal dangers. These memory maps replaced physical charts and required oral discipline. Every captain held great responsibility to remember details accurately. Weather reading skills were equally impressive. Vikings read wave shape, wind temperature, fog texture, and star clarity to predict storm arrival. When conditions threatened survival, they tightened rigging, dropped sails, or altered course. Their thinking resembled modern algorithmic decision-making. Constant data input, constant adjustment. Team structure supported success. Viking ships spent voyages singing rowing songs that regulated rhythm and reduced fatigue. Leadership authority was respected, but crew input mattered. Experienced rowers offered advice about wave direction. Younger men learned fast. Navigation worked because teamwork worked. Psychology also guided navigation. Sailors believed in omen and dream interpretation. These beliefs did not replace science. They complemented it by strengthening morale. Confidence reduces panic. Panic kills sailors. Faith encouraged courage when storms roared through night. Finally, the Vikings succeeded because they built upon gradual experience. They did not leap from Norway to Vinland. They learned through Shetland Islands, Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. Each achievement stretched comfort zone, building data from real voyages. Charting west became logical, not reckless. Modern recreations of Viking ships confirm capability. Experimental voyages using replica longships reached North America successfully, proving technology was effective without engines or modern navigation. These reenactments validate saga testimony, bridging modern understanding and medieval skill. Thus, Norse navigation science shows that reaching Vinland required intellect, observation, and engineering, not miraculous good fortune. Vikings were world-class sailors who turned ocean from barrier into bridge. Their success encourages us to rethink technological history and appreciate ancient innovation. When historians examine the Norse encounters in Vinland, the first question that rises is painfully simple. Why did peaceful relations collapse so quickly? After all, the earliest accounts describe exchanges of goods, gestures of curiosity, and brief periods of calm communication. If both sides benefited from trade, Vikings acquiring furs and food, indigenous groups examining metal tools, why did diplomacy break down to the point of violence? The deeper we explore this question, the more we see that the roots of failure lie not in malice, but in cultural distance, misinterpretation, psychological fear, and incompatible worldviews. First, Norse diplomacy historically relied on negotiated alliances through shared language, symbolic exchange, and kinship structures. Their previous contact experiences were with Europeans, the Irish, English, Franks, Scots, and even those interactions included overlapping spiritual values or political frameworks. In Vinland, they faced societies whose diplomatic traditions were entirely different. Indigenous negotiation did not mirror hierarchical chieftain systems the Norse understood. Instead, diplomacy involved clan representation, consensus, and spiritual consultation. The Vikings interpreted delay or silence during negotiations as weakness or suspicion, not cautious respect. Second, the Norse world valued ownership. When Vikings built structures in Vinland, they claimed land through labor. In their worldview, constructing houses and cultivating fields proved legitimate possession. Meanwhile, indigenous cultures believed land belonged to community and spirit, not individuals. They understood territory through custodianship, not conquest. Seeing permanent Norse houses and fenced areas signaled danger, triggering fear that these foreigners intended to stay forever. Communication failure worsened this divide. Although attempts at language bridging occurred, the distance between Norse and indigenous languages was enormous. Subtle greetings, warnings, and humor became distorted. One group might have considered a gesture friendly, while the other saw dominance. Even trading negotiations became hazardous. Vikings believed refusal to exchange items displayed disrespect or distrust, while indigenous traders simply engaged differently. Value did not rest solely on object, but on relationship and ritual. Fear warped perception. The Vikings carried trauma from harsh Atlantic survival. Every unknown human shape in forest looked like ambush threat. Night echoes sounded like incoming attack. Indigenous groups, on the other hand, saw large armed foreigners occupying coastline territory they had traversed for generations. Their children and elders faced risk from strangers wielding iron. That emotional tension became breeding ground for conflict. Another factor involved scale. Vikings in Vinland numbered under 100. Indigenous populations in surrounding territories numbered in thousands. The Norse eventually realized they held no military advantage. This truth terrified them. For peace to last, both sides required equal power. Instead, imbalance produced defensive aggression. Vikings struck preemptively out of fear of extermination. Indigenous warriors fought to protect sovereignty. Diplomacy also faltered due to time. Vikings sought fast agreements, trade now, settlement now, while indigenous cultures planned for long cycles. Norse schedules revolved around winters and ship return deadlines. Indigenous diplomacy revolved around seasons, spiritual rhythms, and communal decision. Weapons changed dynamic further. Norse steel blades seemed threatening to indigenous observers. Meanwhile, indigenous bows, shot silently from cover, terrified Vikings who had never fought invisible opponents living in forests denser than European woods. Finally, and most importantly, both cultures operated from truth. Home mattered more than strangers. The Norse felt Vinland was destiny. Indigenous peoples felt Vinland was identity. Two truths collided, and diplomacy collapsed under weight of incompatible longing. Therefore, conflict was not inevitable because of hatred. It was inevitable because two civilizations, without time or translation, attempted coexistence on land sacred to both. When conflict began between Vikings and indigenous peoples, it unfolded not as large-scale war, but a series of tactical engagements shaped by terrain, psychology, and worldview. These confrontations reveal that military outcomes do not depend only on weapons. They depend on understanding the battlefield, adapting to environment, and reading enemy intention. In Vinland, the Vikings entered a theater of war completely unlike Europe. They fought in forests rather than open fields, against fast-moving ambush formations rather than shield walls. To understand Vinland combat, we must reconstruct how each side fought and why victory leaned toward indigenous advantage. The first recorded major conflict, as sagas describe, happened during what should have been peaceful exchange. Miscommunication escalated into violence quickly. Arrows were launched before words could form treaties. Vikings responded with sword charges, expecting enemies to flee. But indigenous warriors vanished into forest shadows, retreating without casualties and returning minutes later from new direction. To a Viking soldier trained in group formations, this was bewildering. They were accustomed to symmetrical battle lines, not ghost-like attacks. Indigenous fighting style famously involved mobility and knowledge of terrain. They did not waste lives in head-on combat. They struck from angles impossible for Vikings to defend simultaneously. They understood forest acoustics and used natural sound to mask movement. They used camouflage, animal paths, and riverbank cover. Their bows fired quietly and accurately from distance. Vikings, wearing heavy metal and carrying wide shields, could not maneuver easily through brush. Their armor, which gave advantage in Europe, became liability here. Another important difference lay in leadership. Viking warriors followed single commanders and fought in units bound by loyalty. Indigenous combat groups operated through coordinated autonomy. Small strike teams made decisions fluidly. This decentralized structure confused Norse tactics, which relied on breaking enemy command center. There was no command center to break. Psychological warfare also shaped power balance. Indigenous groups often waited until Vikings relaxed, then attacked suddenly, eroding sleep cycles and morale. They struck at night, at dawn, or during foraging. Their purpose was not annihilation, it was attrition. They aimed to exhaust invaders into leaving. Vikings, unable to sleep deeply or travel safely beyond settlement, lost emotional strength daily. Weapon differences mattered significantly. Viking swords and axes were brutal at close range, but indigenous arrows reduced that advantage. Spears, thrown from behind tree cover, struck with surprising force. Soundless retreat meant Vikings wasted strength chasing illusions. Indigenous warriors controlled supply routes. They blocked berry gathering, fishing access, and wood collection. By restricting Viking mobility, they weaponized geography itself. Vikings never controlled outer environment. They controlled only their fences. Diplomatic tactics became part of warfare, too. Indigenous people intentionally tested Viking behavior, learning emotional triggers. Sometimes, friendly visits would suddenly stop for weeks, creating anxiety. Other times, small groups appeared at riverbanks holding animal skins, acting open to trade. This psychological push and pull destabilized Viking trust. Meanwhile, Viking frustration rose. Men trained their whole lives to fight European warriors in armor. They shouted war cries expecting fear, but indigenous groups saw noise as foolish. Vikings wrote that their enemies attacked, like wind, arriving and disappearing before swords swung fully. The saga story of Thorvald's death reveals tactical truth. During exploration attempt, Viking scouts approached coastal region believing it empty. Indigenous warriors, concealed in scrub and undergrowth, tracked them silently. Once Vikings rested and unarmored, arrows flew, striking Thorvald fatally. Rather than launching suicidal charge, warriors withdrew instantly. Their goal was one decisive casualty, not mass battle. This strategy eroded Viking leadership confidence. Over months, these small-scale defeats accumulated. Vikings began viewing every shadow as enemy, every tree as hiding place. Sleep deprivation and dread weakened discipline. Warriors trained for heroic final battles faced slow-pressure warfare instead. They could not win because war was not contest of strength. It was contest of patience. Thus, the Vikings left Vinland not due to one major defeat, but because indigenous strategy made settlement psychologically unsustainable. Vikings held swords. Their opponents held world beneath their feet. Although sagas emphasize conflict between Norse settlers and indigenous peoples, modern historians propose an alternative interpretation. Peace may have lasted longer and deeper than records show. We must consider that written sagas were composed decades after events, shaped by narrative drama, political influence, and memory bias. It is entirely possible that early cooperation occurred more meaningfully than later violence suggests. Examining interactions through anthropological and archaeological evidence reveals a nuanced picture where exchange, coexistence, and even friendship may have taken place before hostility. First, indigenous groups demonstrated willingness to approach Viking settlements peacefully. Sources describe groups arriving with furs to trade, examining cloth and metal with curiosity rather than fear. They did not immediately attack, though Vikings possessed shocking technology. This restraint implies early diplomacy. Indigenous societies understood value of resource exchange and assessed Norse presence before reacting. If they chose violence instantly, Vikings would not have survived First Winter. Second, the Vikings themselves recorded peaceful trading episodes. They described exchanging milk, cloth, and red dye for animal skins. Red cloth became particularly popular and symbolically meaningful. The willingness to trade suggests significant trust. Such interactions require more than shallow tolerance. They demand shared space, silence without panic, and social confidence. Third, archaeological evidence implies nonviolent coexistence. No mass graves exist around Lance aux Meadows. No burned fortifications or spear-scarred walls have been discovered. Settlement structures remained undamaged. If enormous battles occurred at settlement gates, more physical damage would appear. Instead, the absence of destruction suggests controlled conflict or limited skirmishes rather than prolonged war on Viking doorstep. Fourth, geography itself implies routine meetings. Settlement locations sat near rich fishing waters also used by indigenous communities. Both groups likely encountered each other frequently during foraging. Had immediate hostility defined relationship, violent confrontation would have erupted daily, not episodically. Trade implies that both sides understood benefit of non-aggression. Fifth, cultural borrowing patterns hint at brief cross-learning. Norse accounts record Vikings using canoes to explore river systems, technology learned by observing indigenous design. Meanwhile, indigenous groups received metal tools, perhaps knife blades or nails, improving their own craftsmanship. Mutual borrowing suggests contact deeper than enemies firing arrows from trees. However, peace may have been fragile and conditional. Diplomatic coexistence required careful respect. Small misinterpretations could, and did, lead to disaster. For example, Saga accounts show trade encounter collapsing when an indigenous man tried to take Viking weapon. To Norse warriors, this action signified theft and disrespect. To indigenous eyes, it may have been innocent interest. Cultural misunderstanding detonated peace. Power imbalance contributed to breakdown. Vikings assumed permanent settlement. Indigenous people assumed visiting rights. Once they realized intentions differed, tolerance shrank. Despite failure of long-term peace, early harmony matters. It reminds us that history rarely begins with battle. People usually attempt coexistence before conflict erupts. The first interactions in Vinland likely involved curiosity. Children watching strangers from trees, women studying Viking clothing, and men listening to unfamiliar language sound patterns. Music, laughter, and hand gestures may have once filled space where later silence settled. Recognizing early peace also challenges stereotypes. Vikings were not simply invaders, they attempted diplomacy.